Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Duane W Rimel was an American science fiction, fantasy and erotica writer, most well known for his collaborations with American horror writer Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Lovecraft was a close friend who mentored him in his early writings as early as 1934. Lovecraft and Rimel collaborated on several pieces, such as Dreams of Yith, The Tree on the Hill, and The Disinterment, the latter published in Weird Tales. After Lovecraft's death, Rimel continued to write mythos stories, such as Music of the Stars. Dreams of Yith is a series of sonnets that were much admired by H P Lovecraft. They were first published in the June 1934 issue of the Fantasy Fan. The poem cycle is the first mention of the fictional planet Yith, which Lovecraft adopted as the home planet of his Great Race of Yith in the Shadow Out of Time. The Forbidden Room. Duane W Rimel. Fanciful Tales of Time and Space, Fall 1936. It is said that an old pirate once dwelt in Hampton, but why he chose that secluded and decadent village, no one ever knew, for the place is many miles from the sea, hidden among the back hills. His motive has been interpreted in numerous ways. Some have said it was to escape the sight of the ocean which had been his home, while others have suggested that certain seamen might want to reckon with the aged pirate were he to inhabit the haunts of a sailor. His name was Exer Jones, and that name symbolized wealth, enormous hidden fortunes, which, though none had ever seen them, formed part of the varied legend. When Jones is mentioned, natives will point to a tall three-story dwelling which, with one other, rises from amidst a mouldering group of hovels, and will explain to travelers who happen to stop at the decrepit hotel that such was his house. But unless they know the visitor well, they will tell no more, for the people of Hampton do not like to have their stories ridiculed, as would certainly happen were they to tell all they know of Exer Jones. The edifice has been deserted for many years. No one knows the exact number, and strangers who are attracted to the quaint but sinister place are warned against renting it. Beside the ancient gabled dwelling is another house of enormous proportions, brick-made and ivy-crested, where once lived another man of strange and evil character. The second person, one Hiram Shell, had also been rich, but his existence covered a later span of years than that of Exer Jones, and one which people knew more about. The source of his wealth seemed questionable as well. Before the arrival of Shell in Hampton, and following a rapid decline in Jones's health, the latter was ever seen to have a lamp burning in the upper story of his dwelling. It gleamed into the small hours, as the legend goes, and people passing by the forbidding house thought they heard the muffled clink of coins and queer mumbling noises, as if Pirate Jones were counting again and again his ill-gotten wealth. This went on indefinitely, till at last, one winter morning, the old fellow was found quite stiff and cold at the bottom of the long flight of steps which leads to the upper rooms. They buried him back of the queer dwelling in which he had died, and when the will was read it was discovered that he had given the property to the township, but of his money not one word was said. At the close of the brief document, they found a warning, and to this day it is a whispered tale, surviving the fleeting years. It ran thus: "Pass ye beyond the stairway door. My cursed wealth has left me poor." Ordinarily, such a fatuous couplet would have provoked a hearty laugh from Hampton townspeople, but when they remembered that the stairway door was the one opening on the room from whence the strange noises had come, there were none who wished to venture so far within the house. And too, some argued, the position of Jones' body when discovered was not a pleasant one. For though no marks of violence were found on the corpse, it was possible that instead of falling from the stairs, as was generally supposed, the deceased had leaped purposely to the landing below. But such rumors were not encouraged. The property then lawfully became a part of the township, but though repeated efforts were made by the council to dispose of it at ridiculously low prices, no buyer was ever found. That is, until the advent of Hiram Shell. When this individual settled in Hampton, he chanced to secure a lot adjoining that of the forbidding house, where he plied a meagre trade of cobbling. However, his fiery tongue and irascible temperament soon drove away most of the slim clientele which he had begun to secure, till he was reduced to miserable poverty. As the years passed, he began to assimilate portions of the neighborhood gossip. Just how much or how little he picked up, no one could say. But at night, he was often seen prowling about in the vicinity of the ancient pirate house. Age, too, was creeping rapidly upon the man. Then one day Hampton was surprised to see Hiram Shell displaying signs of uncommon wealth. He bought the best span of horses available, dressed in stylish clothes, and to crown it all, built an enormous brick mansion on the lot, the house which is there today, if Hampton still lives. Accompanying this paradox came another burst of whispered gossip, for it was learned that his purchases were paid for with strange-looking gold coins. And still another incentive for talking was raised when it was revealed that he had bought the ancient and mouldy pirate house on Beacon Street. Whether he knew of the warning against the upper room was a question no one could answer, nor did anyone care to enlighten him either, for Hiram had become even more captious and litigious, and people shunned him as they might some poisonous reptile. About a year later, Sam Perkins, in passing the deserted house one night at 1 a.m., saw a light burning in the topmost story of the dwelling, and when he perceived that it shone from a window of the forbidden room and heard strange clinking sounds which he remembered from years gone by, he ran trembling from the place and spread the news. It was early morning before the gossip got about, and several of the townspeople strolled by the place to see if anything had gone amiss. Noticing no object out of the ordinary, they moved on, not caring to loiter about the house any longer than was necessary. When the day had passed, and no Hiram put in an appearance, and no smoke was seen to rise from his chimneys, people again began their whispering. Here the legend becomes disjointed and varied, and the listener is warned against asking too many questions concerning Hiram Shell. But of what remains, a partial conclusion may be drawn. The man was never found after that, though a diligent search was instituted. Only one place in town was not explored, for local authorities were loath to enter that stairway door. But it was reasoned that if he had died in the forbidden room, the neighbors would soon become aware of his presence, so the door was never opened. The last bit of evidence as to Shell's disappearance was a messy trail which some of the people noticed. It led down the steps away from the locked room and around to the back of the house, being formed, some said, of peculiar footprints and bits of debris as if something heavy had been dragged behind the marks, partly obliterating them. The path went straight to the grave of Exer Jones and abruptly stopped, while the sod about the marker seemed recently disturbed. These facts were kept from the authorities, however, for people did not want Jones's grave uncovered. Of the fragments of tracks which were yet half visible, the old men will say little, but some have hinted that they were unlike ordinary footprints, in that the outline had the appearance of being formed by bones pressing upon the ground instead of flesh. The pirate house still stands beside the great ivy-covered mansion, and to this day, natives of Hampton say that at midnight queer lights gleam from the third-story window and strange clinking sounds are heard, as if Exer Jones were once again mumbling and counting his money. End of The Forbidden Room, Duane W Rimel. The Disinterment by Duane W Rimel and H P Lovecraft. First published Weird Tales, January 1937. I awoke abruptly from a horrible dream and stared wildly about. Then, seeing the high arched ceiling and the narrow stained windows of my friend's room, a flood of uneasy revelation coursed over me. and I knew that all of Andrew's hopes had been realized. I lay supine in a large bed, the posts of which reared upward in dizzy perspective, while on vast shelves about the chamber were the familiar books and antiques I was accustomed to seeing in that secluded corner of the crumbling and ancient mansion which had formed our joint home for many years. On a table by the wall stood a huge candelabrum of early workmanship and design, and the usual light window curtains had been replaced by hangings of somber black, which took on a faint, ghostly luster in the dying light. I recalled forcibly the events preceding my confinement and seclusion in this veritable medieval fortress. They were not pleasant, and I shuddered anew when I remembered the couch that had held me before my tenancy of the present one, the couch that everyone supposed would be my last. Memory burned afresh regarding those hideous circumstances which had compelled me to choose between a true death and a hypothetical one, with a later reanimation by therapeutic methods known only to my comrade, Marshall Andrews. The whole thing had begun when I returned from the Orient a year before and discovered, to my utter horror, that I had contracted leprosy while abroad. I had known that I was taking grave chances in caring for my stricken brother in the Philippines, but no hint of my own affliction appeared until I returned to my native land. Andrews himself had made the discovery and kept it from me as long as possible, but our close acquaintance soon disclosed the awful truth. At once I was quartered in our ancient abode atop the crags overlooking crumbling Hampton, from whose musty halls and quaint arched doorways I was never permitted to go forth. It was a terrible existence, with the yellow shadow hanging constantly over me, yet my friend never faltered in his faith, taking care not to contract the dread scourge, but meanwhile making life as pleasant and comfortable as possible. His widespread, though somewhat sinister fame as a surgeon prevented any authority from discovering my plight and shipping me away. It was after nearly a year of this seclusion, late in August, that Andrews decided on a trip to the West Indies to study native medical methods, he said. I was left in care of Venerable Symes, the household factotum. So far, no outward signs of the disease had developed, and I enjoyed a tolerable, though almost completely private existence during my colleague's absence. It was during this time that I read many of the tomes Andrews had acquired in the course of his 20 years as a surgeon, and learned why his reputation, though locally of the highest, was just a bit shady. For the volumes included any number of fanciful subjects hardly related to modern medical knowledge, treatises and unauthoritative articles on monstrous experiments in surgery, accounts of the bizarre effects of glandular transplantation and rejuvenation in animals and men alike, brochures on attempted brain transference, and a host of other fanatical speculations not countenanced by orthodox physicians. It appeared, too, that Andrews was an authority on obscure medicaments, some of the few books I waded through revealing that he had spent much time in chemistry and in the search for new drugs which might be used as aids in surgery. Looking back at those studies now, I find them hellishly suggestive when associated with his later experiments. Andrews was gone longer than I expected, returning early in November, almost 4 months later, and when he did arrive, I was quite anxious to see him, since my condition was at last on the brink of becoming noticeable. I had reached a point where I must seek absolute privacy to keep from being discovered, but my anxiety was slight as compared with his exuberance over a certain new plan he had hatched while in the Indies, a plan to be carried out with the aid of a curious drug he had learned of from a native doctor in Haiti. When he explained that his idea concerned me, I became somewhat alarmed, though in my position there could be little to make my plight worse. I had indeed considered more than once the oblivion that would come with a revolver or a plunge from the roof to the jagged rocks below. On the day after his arrival in the seclusion of the dimly lit study, he outlined the whole grisly scheme. He had found in Haiti a drug, the formula for which he would develop later, which induced a state of profound sleep in anyone taking it, a trance so deep that death was closely counterfeited. With all muscular reflexes, even the respiration and heartbeat completely stilled for the time being. Andrews had, he said, seen it demonstrated on natives many times. Some of them remained somnolent for days at a time, wholly immobile, and as much like death as death itself. This suspended animation, he explained further, would even pass the closest examination of any medical man. He himself, according to all known laws, would have to report as dead a man under the influence of such a drug. He stated too that the subject's body assumed the precise appearance of a corpse, even a slight rigor mortis developing in prolonged cases. For some time his purpose did not seem wholly clear, but when the full import of his words became apparent, I felt weak and nauseated. Yet in another way, I was relieved, for the thing meant at least a partial escape from my curse, an escape from the banishment and shame of an ordinary death of the dread leprosy. Briefly, his plan was to administer a strong dose of the drug to me and call the local authorities, who would immediately pronounce me dead and see that I was buried within a very short while. He felt assured that with their careless examination they would fail to notice my leprosy symptoms, which in truth had hardly appeared. Only a trifle over 15 months had passed since I had caught the disease, whereas the corruption takes 7 years to run its entire course. Later, he said, would come resurrection. After my interment in the family graveyard, beside my centuried dwelling and barely a quarter-mile from his own ancient pile, the appropriate steps would be taken. Finally, when my estate was settled and my decease widely known, he would secretly open the tomb and bring me to his own abode again, still alive and none the worse for my adventure. It seemed a ghastly and daring plan, but to me it offered the only hope for even a partial freedom, so I accepted his proposition, but not without a myriad of misgivings. What if the effect of the drug should wear off while I was in my tomb? What if the coroner should discover the awful ruse and fail to inter me? These were some of the hideous doubts which assailed me before the experiment, though death would have been a release from my curse. I feared it even worse than the yellow scourge, feared it even when I could see its black wings constantly hovering over me. Fortunately, I was spared the horror of viewing my own funeral and burial rites. They must, however, have gone just as Andrews had planned, even to the subsequent disinterment, for after the initial dose of the poison from Haiti, I lapsed into a semi-paralytic state, and from that to a profound night-black sleep. The drug had been administered in my room, and Andrews had told me before giving it that he would recommend to the coroner a verdict of heart failure due to nerve strain. Of course, there was no embalming. Andrews saw to that, and the whole procedure, leading up to my secret transportation from the graveyard to his crumbling manor, covered a period of 3 days. Having been buried late in the afternoon of the 3rd day, my body was secured by Andrews that very night. He had replaced the fresh sod, just as it had been when the workmen left. Old Symes, sworn to secrecy, had helped Andrews in his ghoulish task. Later, I had lain for over a week in my old familiar bed. Owing to some unexpected effect of the drug, my whole body was completely paralyzed, so that I could move my head only slightly. All my senses, however, were fully alert, and by another week's time I was able to take nourishment in good quantities. Andrews explained that my body would gradually regain its former sensibilities, though owing to the presence of the leprosy it might take considerable time. He seemed greatly interested in analyzing my daily symptoms, and always asked if there was any feeling present in my body. Many days passed before I was able to control any part of my anatomy, and much longer before the paralysis crept from my enfeebled limbs so that I could feel the ordinary bodily reactions. Lying and staring at my numb hulk was like having it injected with a perpetual anesthetic. There was a total alienation I could not understand, considering that my head and neck were quite alive and in good health. Andrews explained that he had revived my upper half first and could not account for the complete bodily paralysis. though my condition seemed to trouble him little considering the damnably intent interest he centered upon my reactions and stimuli from the very beginning. Many times during lulls in our conversation, I would catch a strange gleam in his eyes as he viewed me on the couch, a glint of victorious exultation, which, queerly enough, he never voiced aloud, though he seemed to be quite glad that I had run the gauntlet of death and had come through alive. Still, there was that horror I was to meet in less than 6 years, which added to my desolation and melancholy during the tedious days in which I awaited the return of normal bodily functions. But I would be up and about, he assured me, before very long, enjoying an existence few men had ever experienced. The words did not, however, impress me with their true and ghastly meaning until many days later. During that awful siege in bed, Andrews and I became somewhat estranged. He no longer treated me so much like a friend as like an implement in his skilled and greedy fingers. I found him possessed of unexpected traits, little examples of baseness and cruelty, apparent even to the hardened Symes, which disturbed me in a most unusual manner. Often he would display extraordinary cruelty to live specimens in his laboratory, for he was constantly carrying on various hidden projects in glandular and muscular transplantation on guinea pigs and rabbits. He had also been employing his newly discovered sleeping potion in curious experiments with suspended animation. But of these things he told me very little, though old Symes often let slip chance comments which shed some light on the proceedings. I was not certain how much the old servant knew, but he had surely learned considerable, being a constant companion to both Andrews and myself. With the passage of time, a slow but consistent feeling began creeping into my disabled body, and at the reviving symptoms Andrews took a fanatical interest in my case. He still seemed more coldly analytical than sympathetic toward me, taking my pulse and heartbeat with more than usual zeal. Occasionally, in his fevered examinations, I saw his hands tremble slightly, an uncommon sight with so skilled a surgeon, but he seemed oblivious of my scrutiny. I was never allowed even a momentary glimpse of my full body, but with the feeble return of the sense of touch, I was aware of a bulk and heaviness which at first seemed awkward and unfamiliar. Gradually I regained the use of my hands and arms, and with the passing of the paralysis came a new and terrible sensation of physical estrangement. My limbs had difficulty in following the commands of my mind, and every movement was jerky and uncertain. So clumsy were my hands that I had to become accustomed to them all over again. This must, I thought, be due to my disease and the advance of the contagion in my system. Being unaware of how the early symptoms affected the victim, my brother's being a more advanced case, I had no means of judging, and since Andrews shunned the subject, I deemed it better to remain silent. One day I asked Andrews, I no longer considered him a friend, if I might try rising and sitting up in bed. At first he objected strenuously, but later, after cautioning me to keep the blankets well up around my chin, so that I would not be chilled, he permitted it. This seemed strange, in view of the comfortable temperature. Now that late autumn was slowly turning into winter, the room was always well heated. A growing chilliness at night, and occasional glimpses of a leaden sky through the window, had told me of the changing season, for no calendar was ever in sight upon the dingy walls. With the gentle help of Symes I was eased to a sitting position, Andrews coldly watching from the door to the laboratory. At my success, a slow smile spread across his leering features, and he turned to disappear from the darkened doorway. His mood did nothing to improve my condition. Old Symes, usually so regular and consistent, was now often late in his duties, sometimes leaving me alone for hours at a time. The terrible sense of alienation was heightened by my new position. It seemed that the legs and arms inside my gown were hardly able to follow the summoning of my mind, and it became mentally exhausting to continue movement for any length of time. My fingers, woefully clumsy, were wholly unfamiliar to my inner sense of touch, and I wondered vaguely if I were to be accursed the rest of my days with an awkwardness induced by my dread malady. It was on the evening following my half-recovery that the dreams began. I was tormented not only at night but during the day as well. I would awaken, screaming horribly, from some frightful nightmare I dared not think about outside the realm of sleep. These dreams consisted mainly of ghoulish things, graveyards at night, stalking corpses, and lost souls amid a chaos of blinding light and shadow. The terrible reality of the visions disturbed me most of all. It seemed that some inside influence was inducing the grisly vistas of moonlit tombstones and endless catacombs of the restless dead. I could not place their source, and at the end of a week I was quite frantic with abominable thoughts which seemed to obtrude themselves upon my unwelcome consciousness. By that time a slow plan was forming whereby I might escape the living hell into which I had been propelled. Andrews cared less and less about me, seeming intent only on my progress and growth and recovery of normal muscular reactions. I was becoming every day more convinced of the nefarious doings going on in that laboratory across the threshold. The animal cries were shocking and rasped hideously on my overwrought nerves. And I was gradually beginning to think that Andrews had not saved me from deportation solely for my own benefit, but for some accursed reason of his own. Symes's attention was slowly becoming slighter and slighter, and I was convinced that the aged servitor had a hand in the deviltry somewhere. Andrews no longer eyed me as a friend, but as an object of experimentation, nor did I like the way he fingered his scalpel when he stood in the narrow doorway and stared at me with crafty alertness. I had never before seen such a transformation come over any man. His ordinarily handsome features were now lined and whisker-grown, and his eyes gleamed as if some imp of Satan were staring from them. His cold, calculating gaze made me shudder horribly, and gave me a fresh determination to free myself from his bondage as soon as possible. I had lost track of time during my dream orgy, and had no way of knowing how fast the days were passing. The curtains were often drawn in the daytime, the room being lit by waxen cylinders in the large candelabrum. It was a nightmare of living horror and unreality, though through it all I was gradually becoming stronger. I always gave careful responses to Andrew's inquiries concerning my returning physical control, concealing the fact that a new life was vibrating through me with every passing day. An altogether strange sort of strength, but one which I was counting on to serve me in the coming crisis. Finally, one chilly evening when the candles had been extinguished, and a pale shaft of moonlight fell through the dark curtains upon my bed, I determined to rise and carry out my plan of action. There had been no movement from either of my captors for several hours, and I was confident that both were asleep in adjoining bedchambers. Shifting my cumbersome weight carefully, I rose to a sitting position and crawled cautiously out of bed, down upon the floor. A vertigo gripped me momentarily, and a wave of weakness flooded my entire being. But finally strength returned, and by clutching at a bedpost I was able to stand upon my feet for the first time in many months. Gradually a new strength coursed through me, and I donned the dark robe which I had seen hanging on a nearby chair. It was quite long, but served as a cloak over my nightdress. Again came that feeling of awful unfamiliarity which I had experienced in bed, that sense of alienation and of difficulty in making my limbs perform as they should. But there was need for haste before my feeble strength might give out. As a last precaution in dressing, I slipped some old shoes over my feet, but though I could have sworn they were my own, they seemed abnormally loose, so that I decided they must belong to the aged Symes. Seeing no other heavy objects in the room, I seized from the table the huge candelabrum, upon which the moon shone with a pallid glow, and proceeded very quietly toward the laboratory door. My first steps came jerkily and with much difficulty, and in the semi-darkness I was unable to make my way very rapidly. When I reached the threshold, a glance within revealed my former friend seated in a large, overstuffed chair, while beside him was a smoking stand upon which were assorted bottles and a glass. He reclined halfway in the moonlight through the large window, and his greasy features were creased in a drunken smirk. An opened book lay in his lap, one of the hideous tomes from his private library. For a long moment I gloated over the prospect before me, and then, stepping forward suddenly, I brought the heavy weapon down upon his unprotected head. The dull crunch was followed by a spurt of blood, and the fiend crumpled to the floor, his head laid half open. I felt no contrition at taking the man's life in such a manner. In the hideous, half-visible specimens of his surgical wizardry scattered about the room in various stages of completion and preservation, I felt there was enough evidence to blast his soul without my aid. Andrews had gone too far in his practices to continue living, and as one of his monstrous specimens, of that I was now hideously certain. It was my duty to exterminate him. Symes, I realized, would be no such easy matter. Indeed, only unusual good fortune had caused me to find Andrews unconscious. When I finally reeled up to the servants' bedchamber door, faint from exhaustion, I knew it would take all my remaining strength to complete the ordeal. The old man's room was in utmost darkness, being on the north side of the structure, but he must have seen me silhouetted in the doorway as I came in. He screamed hoarsely, and I aimed the candelabrum at him from the threshold. It struck something soft, making a slouging sound in the darkness, but the screaming continued. From that time on, events became hazy and jumbled together, but I remember grappling with the man and choking the life from him little by little. He gibbered a host of awful things before I could lay hands on him, cried and begged for mercy from my clutching fingers. I hardly realized my own strength in that mad moment which left Andrews' associate in a condition like his own. Retreating from the darkened chamber, I stumbled for the stairway door, sagged through it, and somehow reached the landing below. No lamps were burning, and my only light was a filtering of moonbeams coming from the narrow windows in the hall. But I made my jerky way over the cold, damp slabs of stone, reeling from the terrible weakness of my exertion, and reached the front door after ages of fumbling and crawling about in the darkness. Vague memories and haunting shadows came to taunt me in that ancient hallway, shadows once friendly and understandable, but now grown alien and unrecognizable, so that I stumbled down the worn steps in a frenzy of something more than fear. For a moment I stood in the shadow of the giant stone manor, viewing the moonlit trail down which I must go to reach the home of my forefathers, only a quarter of a mile distant. But the way seemed long, and for a while I despaired of ever traversing the whole of it. At last I grasped a piece of dead wood as a cane and set out down the winding road. Ahead, seemingly only a few rods away in the moonlight, stood the venerable mansion where my ancestors had lived and died. Its turrets rose spectrally in the shimmering radiance, and the black shadow cast on the beetling hillside appeared to shift and waver, as if belonging to a castle of unreal substance. There stood the monument of half a century, a haven for all my family old and young, which I had deserted many years ago to live with the fanatical Andrews. It stood empty on that fateful night, and I hope that it may always remain so. In some manner I reached the aged place, though I do not remember the last half of the journey at all. It was enough to be near the family cemetery, among whose moss-covered and crumbling stones I would seek the oblivion I had desired. As I approached the moonlit spot, the old familiarity, so absent during my abnormal existence, returned to plague me in a wholly unexpected way. I drew close to my own tombstone, and the feeling of homecoming grew stronger. With it came a fresh flood of that awful sense of alienation and disembodiment which I knew so well. I was satisfied that the end was drawing near, nor did I stop to analyze emotions till a little later, when the full horror of my position burst upon me. Intuitively I knew my own tombstone, for the grass had scarcely begun to grow between the pieces of sod. With feverish haste I began clawing at the mound, and scraping the wet earth from the hole left by the removal of the grass and roots. How long I worked in the nitrous soil before my fingers struck the coffin lid, I can never say, but sweat was pouring from me and my nails were but useless, bleeding hooks. At last I threw out the last bit of loose earth, and with trembling fingers tugged on the heavy lid. It gave a trifle, and I was prepared to lift it completely open when a fetid and nauseous odor assailed my nostrils. I started erect, horrified. Had some idiot placed my tombstone on the wrong grave, causing me to unearth another body? For surely there could be no mistaking that awful stench. Gradually a hideous uncertainty came over me and I scrambled from the hole. One look at the newly made headpiece was enough. This was indeed my own grave. But what fool had buried within it another corpse? All at once a bit of the unspeakable truth propelled itself upon my brain. The odor, in spite of its putrescence, seemed somehow familiar, horribly familiar, yet I could not credit my senses with such an idea. Reeling and cursing, I fell into the black cavity once more, and by the aid of a hastily lit match, lifted the long lid completely open. Then the light went out, as if extinguished by a malignant hand, and I clawed my way out of that accursed pit, screaming in a frenzy of fear and loathing. When I regained consciousness, I was lying before the door of my own ancient manor, where I must have crawled after that hideous rendezvous in the family cemetery. I realized that dawn was close at hand, and rose feebly, opening the aged portal before me and entering the place which had known no footsteps for over a decade. A fever was ravaging my weakened body, so that I was hardly able to stand, but I made my way slowly through the musty, dimly lit chambers and staggered into my own study, the study I had deserted so many years before. When the sun has risen, I shall go to the ancient well beneath the old willow tree by the cemetery and cast my deformed self into it. No other man shall ever view this blasphemy which has survived life longer than it should have. I do not know what people will say when they see my disordered grave, but this will not trouble me if I can find oblivion from that which I beheld amidst the crumbling, moss-crusted stones of the hideous place. I know now why Andrews was so secretive in his actions, so damnably gloating in his attitude toward me after my artificial death. He had meant me for a specimen all the time, a specimen of his greatest feat of surgery, his masterpiece of unclean witchery. An example of perverted artistry for him alone to see. Where Andrews obtained that other with which I lay accursed in his mouldering mansion, I shall probably never know. But I am afraid that it was brought from Haiti along with his fiendish medicine. At least these long hairy arms and horrible short legs are alien to me, alien to all natural and sane laws of mankind. The thought that I shall be tortured with that other during the rest of my brief existence is another hell. Now I can but wish for that which once was mine, that which every man blessed of God ought to have at death, that which I saw in that awful moment in the ancient burial ground when I raised the lid on the coffin. My own shrunken, decayed, and headless body. End of the Disinterment by Duane W Rimel and H P Lovecraft. Dreams of Yith by Duane W Rimel. The Fantasy Fan, June 1934. 1. In distant Yith pass crested, ragged peaks. On far-flung, islands lost to worldly eyes. A shadow from the ancient star void seeks, some being which in caverns shrilly cries. A challenge, and the hairy dweller speaks. From that deep hole where slimy Sotho lies. But when those night winds crept about the place, they fled, for Sotho had no human face. 2. Beyond the valleys of the sun which lie, in misty chaos past the reach of time, and brood beneath the ice as aeons fly, long waiting for some brighter, warmer clime, there is a vision, as I vainly try, to glimpse the madness that must someday climb from age-old tombs in dim dimensions hid, and push all angles back, unseal the lid. 3. Beside the city that once lived their wound, a stream of putrefaction writhing black, reflecting crumbling spires stuck in the ground, that glow through hovering mist whence no stray track can lead to those dead gates where once was found the secret that would bring the dwellers back. And still that pitch-black current eddies by those silver gates of Yith to seabeds dry. 4. On rounded turrets rising through the Visne, of cloud-veiled aeons that the old ones knew, on tablets deeply worn and fingered clean, by tentacles that dreamers seldom view, in space-hung Yith, on clammy walls obscene, that writhe and crumble and are built anew. There is a figure carved, but God, those eyes, that sway on fungoid stems at leaden skies. 5. Around the place of ancient, waiting blight, on walls of sheerest opal rearing high, that move as planets beckon in the night, to faded realms where nothing sane can lie. A deathless guard tramps by in feeble light, emitting to the stars a sobbing cry. But on that path where footsteps should have led, there rolled an eyeless, huge and bloated head. 6. Amid dim hills that poison mosses blast, far from the lands and seas of our clean earth, dread nightmare shadows dance, obscenely cast by twisted talons of Archaean birth, on rows of slimy pillars stretching past, a daemon fane that echoes with mad mirth, and in that realm sane eyes may never see, for black light streams from skies of ebony. 7. On those queer mountains which hold back the horde, that lie in waiting in their mouldy graves, who groan and mumble to a hidden lord, still waiting for the time-worn key that saves, there dwells a watcher who can ill afford to let invaders by those hoary caves, but someday then may dreamers find the way that leads down elfin-painted paths of grey. 8. And past those unclean spires that ever lean above the windings of unpeopled streets, and far beyond the walls and silver screen, that veils the secrets of those dim retreats, a scarlet pathway leads that some have seen, in wildest visions that no mortal greets, and down that dimming path in fearful flight, queer beings squirm and hasten in the night. 9. High in the ebon skies on scaly wings, dread bat-like beasts soar past those towers grey, to peer in greedy longing at the things which sprawl in every twisted passageway, and when their gruesome flight a shadow brings, the dwellers lift dim eyes above the clay, but lidded bulbs close heavily once more. They wait for Sotho to unlatch the door. 10. Now, though the veil of troubled visions deep is draped to blind me to the secret ways, leading though blackness to the realm of sleep, that haunts me all my jumbled nights and days, I feel the dim path that will let me keep that rendezvous in Yith where Sotho plays. At last I see a glowing turret shine, and I am coming, for the key is mine. End of Dreams of Yith by Duane W Rimel. The Tree on the Hill by Duane W Rimel and H P Lovecraft. Written 1934 and published in 1940 in Polaris. Chapter 1. Southeast of Hampton, near the tortuous Salmon River Gorge, is a range of steep, rocky hills which have defied all efforts of sturdy homesteaders. The canyons are too deep, and the slopes too precipitous to encourage anything save seasonal livestock grazing. The last time I visited Hampton, the region, known as Hell's Acres, was part of the Blue Mountain Forest Reserve. There are no roads linking this inaccessible locality with the outside world, and the hillfolk will tell you that it is indeed a spot transplanted from His Satanic Majesty's front yard. There is a local superstition that the area is haunted, but by what or by whom no one seems to know. Natives will not venture within its mysterious depths, for they believe the story is handed down to them by the Nez Perce Indians, who have shunned the region for untold generations, because, according to them, it is a playground of certain giant devils from the outside. These suggestive tales made me very curious. My first excursion, and my last, thank God, into those hills occurred while Constantine Thunis and I were living in Hampton the summer of 1938. He was writing a treatise on Egyptian mythology, and I found myself alone much of the time, despite the fact that we shared a modest cabin on Beacon Street, within sight of the infamous Pirate House. Built by Exa Jones over 60 years ago. The morning of June 23rd found me walking in those oddly shaped hills, which had, since 7 o'clock, seemed very ordinary indeed. I must have been about 7 miles south of Hampden before I noticed anything unusual. I was climbing a grassy ridge overlooking a particularly deep canyon, when I came upon an area totally devoid of the usual bunchgrass and greaseweed. It extended southward, over numerous hills and valleys. At first I thought the spot had been burned over the previous fall, but upon examining the turf, I found no signs of a blaze. The nearby slopes and ravines looked terribly scarred and seared, as if some gigantic torch had blasted them, wiping away all vegetation. And yet there was no evidence of fire. I moved on over rich black soil in which no grass flourished. As I headed for the approximate center of this desolate area, I began to notice a strange silence. There were no larks, no rabbits, and even the insects seemed to have deserted the place. I gained the summit of a lofty knoll and tried to guess at the size of that bleak, inexplicable region. Then I saw the lone tree. It stood on a hill somewhat higher than its companions and attracted the eye because it was so utterly unexpected. I had seen no trees for miles. Thorn and hackberry bushes clustered the shallower ravines, but there had been no mature trees. Strange to find one standing on the crest of the hill. I crossed 2 steep canyons before I came to it, and a surprise awaited me. It was not a pine tree, nor a fir tree, nor a hackberry tree. I had never, in all my life, seen one to compare with it, and I never have to this day, for which I am eternally thankful. More than anything, it resembled an oak. It had a huge, twisted trunk, fully a yard in diameter, and the large limbs began spreading outward scarcely 7 feet from the ground. The leaves were round, and curiously alike in size and design. It might have been a tree painted on a canvas, but I will swear that it was real. I shall always know that it was real, despite what Thunis said later. I recall that I glanced at the sun and judged the time to be about 10 o'clock a.m., although I did not look at my watch. The day was becoming warm, and I sat for a while in the welcome shade of the huge tree. Then I regarded the rank grass that flourished beneath it. Another singular phenomenon when I remembered the bleak terrain through which I had passed. A wild maze of hills, ravines and bluffs hemmed me in on all sides, although the rise on which I sat was rather higher than any other within miles. I looked far to the east, and I jumped to my feet, startled and amazed. Shimmering through a blue haze of distance were the Bitterroot Mountains. There is no other range of snow-capped peaks within 300 miles of Hampton, and I knew, at this altitude, that I shouldn't be seeing them at all. For several minutes I gazed at the marvel. Then I became drowsy. I lay in the rank grass beneath the tree. I unstrapped my camera, took off my hat and relaxed, staring skyward through the green leaves. I closed my eyes. Then a curious phenomenon began to assail me. A vague, cloudy sort of vision, glimpsing or daydreaming seemingly without relevance to anything familiar. I thought I saw a great temple by a sea of ooze, where 3 suns gleamed in a pale red sky. The vast tomb or temple was an anomalous color, a nameless blue-violet shade. Large beasts flew in the cloudy sky, and I seemed to hear the pounding of their scaly wings. I went nearer the stone temple, and a huge doorway loomed in front of me. Within that portal were swirling shadows that seemed to dart and leer and try to snatch me inside that awful darkness. I thought I saw 3 flaming eyes in the shifting void of a doorway, and I screamed with mortal fear. In that noisome depth, I knew, lurked utter destruction, a living hell even worse than death. I screamed again. The vision faded. I saw the round leaves in the sane earthly sky. I struggled to rise. I was trembling. Cold perspiration beaded my brow. I had a mad impulse to flee, run insanely from that sinister tree on the hill, but I checked the absurd intuition and sat down, trying to collect my senses. Never had I dreamed anything so realistic, so horrifying. What had caused the vision? I had been reading several of Theeunis's tomes on ancient Egypt. I mopped my forehead and decided that it was time for lunch. But I did not feel like eating. Then I had an inspiration. I would take a few snapshots of the tree for Theunis. They might shock him out of his habitual air of unconcern. Perhaps I would tell him about the dream. Opening my camera, I took 6 shots of the tree and every aspect of the landscape as seen from the tree. Also, I included one of the gleaming, snow-crested peaks. I might want to return, and these photos would help. Folding the camera, I returned to my cushion of soft grass. Had that spot beneath the tree a certain alien enchantment? I know that I was reluctant to leave it. I gazed upward at the curious round leaves. I closed my eyes. A breeze stirred the branches, and their whispered music lulled me into tranquil oblivion. And suddenly I saw again the pale red sky and the 3 suns, the land of 3 shadows. Again the great temple came into view. I seemed to be floating on the air, a disembodied spirit exploring the wonders of a mad, multidimensional world. The temple's oddly angled cornices frightened me, and I knew that this place was one that no man on earth had ever seen in his wildest dreams. Again the vast doorway yawned before me, and I was sucked within that black, writhing cloud. I seemed to be staring at space unlimited. I saw a void beyond my vocabulary to describe, a dark, bottomless gulf, teeming with nameless shapes and entities, things of madness and delirium, as tenuous as a mist from Shambhala. My soul shrank. I was terribly afraid. I screamed and felt that I would soon go mad. Then in my dream, I ran and ran in a fever of utter terror. But I did not know what I was running from. I left that hideous temple and that hellish void, yet I knew I must, barring some miracle, return. At last my eyes flew open. I was not beneath a tree. I was sprawled on a rocky slope, my clothing torn and disordered. My hands were bleeding. I stood up, pain stabbing through me. I recognized the spot, the ridge where I had first seen the blasted area. I must have walked miles, unconscious. The tree was not in sight, and I was glad. Even the knees of my trousers were torn, as if I had crawled part of the way. I glanced at the sun. Late afternoon. Where had I been? I snatched out my watch. It had stopped at 10:34. Chapter 2. "So you have the snapshots?" Theunis drawled. I met his grey eyes across the breakfast table. 3 days had slipped by since my return from Hell's Acres. I had told him about the dream beneath the tree, and he had laughed. "Yes," I replied. "They came last night. Haven't had a chance to open them yet. Give them a good, careful study. If they aren't all failures, perhaps you'll change your mind." Theunis smiled, sipped his coffee. I gave him the unopened envelope, and he quickly broke the seal and withdrew the pictures. He glanced at the first one, and the smile faded from his leonine face. He crushed out his cigarette. "My God, man, look at this." I seized the glossy rectangle. It was the first picture of the tree, taken at a distance of 50 feet or so. The cause of Theunis's excitement escaped me. There it was, standing boldly on the hill, while below it grew the jungle of grass where I had lain. In the distance were my snow-capped mountains. "There you are," I cried, "the proof of my story." "Look at it," Theunis snapped. "The shadows. There are 3 for every rock, bush and tree. He was right. Below the tree, spread in fan-like incongruity, lay 3 overlapping shadows. Suddenly I realized that the picture held an abnormal and inconsistent element. The leaves on the thing were too lush for the work of sane nature, while the trunk was bulged and knotted in the most abhorrent shapes. Theunis dropped the picture on the table. "There is something wrong," I muttered. "The tree I saw didn't look as repulsive as that." "Are you sure?" Theunis grated. "The fact is, you may have seen many things not recorded on this film. It shows more than I saw. That's the point. There is something damnably out of place in this landscape, something I can't understand. The tree seems to suggest a thought, beyond my grasp. It is too misty, too uncertain, too unreal to be natural." He rapped nervous fingers on the table. He snatched the remaining films and shuffled through them rapidly. I reached for the snapshot he had dropped and sensed a touch of bizarre uncertainty and strangeness as my eyes absorbed its every detail. The flowers and weeds pointed at varying angles, while some of the grass grew in the most bewildering fashion. The tree seemed too veiled and clouded to be readily distinguished, but I noted the huge limbs and the half-bent flower stems that were ready to fall over, yet did not fall, and the many overlapping shadows. They were, altogether, very disquieting shadows, too long or short when compared to the stems they fell below to give one a feeling of comfortable normality. The landscape hadn't shocked me the day of my visit. There was a dark familiarity and mocking suggestion in it, something tangible, yet distant as the stars beyond the galaxy. Theunis came back to Earth. "Did you mention 3 suns in your dreaming orgy?" I nodded, frankly puzzled. Then it dawned on me. My fingers trembled slightly as I stared at the picture again. My dream. Of course. The others are just like it, Theunis said. That same uncertainness, that suggestion. I should be able to catch the mood of the thing, see it in its real light, but it is too. Perhaps later I shall find out, if I look at it long enough. We sat in silence for some time. A thought came to me suddenly, prompted by a strange, inexplicable longing to visit the tree again. "Let's make an excursion. I think I can take you there in half a day." "You'd better stay away," replied Theunis thoughtfully. "I doubt if you could find the place again if you wanted to." "Nonsense," I replied. "Surely with these photos to guide us, did you see any familiar landmarks in them?" His observation was uncanny. After looking through the remaining snaps carefully, I had to admit that there were none. Theunis muttered under his breath and drew viciously on his cigarette. A perfectly normal, or nearly so, picture of a spot apparently dropped from nowhere. Seeing mountains at this low altitude is preposterous. But wait. He sprang from the chair as a hunted animal and raced from the room. I could hear him moving about in our makeshift library, cursing volubly. Before long, he reappeared with an old, leather-bound volume. Theunis opened it reverently and peered over the odd characters. "What do you call that?" I inquired. "This is an early English translation of the Chronicle of Nath, written by Rudolf Jürgler, a German mystic and alchemist who borrowed some of his lore from Hermes Trismegistus, the ancient Egyptian sorcerer. There is a passage here that might interest you, might make you understand why this business is even further from the natural than you suspect. Listen. So in the year of the black goat, there came unto Nath a shadow that should not be on earth, and that had no form known to the eyes of earth. And it fed on the souls of men, they that it gnawed being lured and blinded with dreams till the horror and the endless night lay upon them. Nor did they see that which gnawed them, for the shadow took false shapes that men know or dream of, and only freedom seemed waiting in the land of the 3 suns. But it was told by priests of the old book that he who could see the shadow's true shape and live after the seeing might shun its doom and send it back to the starless gulf of its spawning. This none could do save through the gem, wherefore did Ka-Nefer the high priest keep that gem sacred in the temple. And when it was lost with Phrynes, he who braved the horror and was never seen more, there was weeping in Nath. Yet did the shadow depart sated at last, nor shall it hunger again till the cycles roll back to the year of the black goat. Theunis paused while I stared, bewildered. Finally he spoke. Now, single, I suppose you can guess how all this links up. There is no need of going deep into the primal lore behind this business, but I may as well tell you that according to the old legends, This is the so-called Year of the Black Goat, when certain horrors from the fathomless outside are supposed to visit the earth and do infinite harm. We don't know how they'll be manifest, but there's reason to think that strange mirages and hallucinations will be mixed up in the matter. I don't like the thing you've run up against. The story or the pictures. It may be pretty bad, and I warn you to look out. But first I must try to do what old Jurgla says, to see if I can glimpse the matter as it is. Fortunately, the old gem he mentions has been rediscovered. I know where I can get at it. We must use it on the photographs and see what we see. It's more or less like a lens or prism, though one can't take photographs with it. Someone of peculiar sensitiveness might look through and sketch what he sees. There's a bit of danger, and the looker may have his consciousness shaken a trifle, for the real shape of the shadow isn't pleasant and doesn't belong on this earth. But it would be a lot more dangerous not to do anything about it. Meanwhile, if you value your life and sanity, keep away from that hill, and from the thing you think is a tree on it. I was more bewildered than ever. How can there be organized beings from the outside in our midst? I cried. How do we know that such things exist? You reason in terms of this tiny earth, Theonis said. Surely you don't think that the world is a rule for measuring the universe. There are entities we never dream of floating under our very noses. Modern science is thrusting back the borderland of the unknown and proving that the mystics were not so far off the track. Suddenly I knew that I did not want to look at the picture again. I wanted to destroy it. I wanted to run from it. Theonis was suggesting something beyond. A trembling cosmic fear gripped me and drew me away from the hideous picture, for I was afraid I would recognize some object in it. I glanced at my friend. He was poring over the ancient book, a strange expression on his face. He sat up straight. Let's call the thing off for today. I'm tired of this endless guessing and wondering. I must get the loan of the gem from the museum where it is, and do what is to be done. As you say, I replied. Will you have to go to Croydon? He nodded. Then we'll both go home, I said decisively. Chapter 3. I need not chronicle the events of the fortnight that followed. With me they formed a constant and enervating struggle between a mad longing to return to the cryptic tree of dreams and freedom, and a frenzied dread of that selfsame thing and all connected with it. That I did not return is perhaps less a matter of my own will than a matter of pure chance. Meanwhile, I knew that Theonis was desperately active in some investigation of the strangest nature, something which included a mysterious motor trip and a return under circumstances of the greatest secrecy. By hints over the telephone, I was made to understand that he had somewhere borrowed the obscure and primal object mentioned in the ancient volume as the gem, and that he was busy devising a means of applying it to the photographs I had left with him. He spoke fragmentarily of refraction, polarization, and unknown angles of space and time, and indicated that he was building a kind of box or camera obscura for the study of the curious snapshots with the gem's aid. It was on the 16th day that I received the startling message from the hospital in Croydon. Theonis was there and wanted to see me at once. He had suffered some odd sort of seizure, being found prone and unconscious by friends who found their way into his house after hearing certain cries of mortal agony and fear. Though still weak and helpless, he had now regained his senses and seemed frantic to tell me something and have me perform certain important duties. This much the hospital informed me over the wire, and within half an hour I was at my friend's bedside, marveling at the inroads which worry and tension had made on his features in so brief a time. His first act was to move away the nurses in order to speak in utter confidence. Single, I saw it. His voice was strained and husky. You must destroy them all, those pictures. I sent it back by seeing it, but the pictures had better go. That tree will never be seen on the hill again. At least, I hope not. Till thousands of eons bring back the year of the black goat. You are safe now. Mankind is safe. He paused, breathing heavily, and continued. Take the gem out of the apparatus and put it in the safe. You know the combination. It must go back where it came from, for there's a time when it may be needed to save the world. They won't let me leave here yet, but I can rest if I know it's safe. Don't look through the box as it is. It would fix you as it's fixed me. And burn those damned photographs. The one in the box and the others. But Theonis was exhausted now, and the nurses advanced and motioned me away as he leaned back and closed his eyes. In another half hour, I was at his house and looking curiously at the long black box on the library table beside the overturned chair. Scattered papers blew about in a breeze from the open window, and close to the box I recognized with a queer sensation the envelope of pictures I had taken. It required only a moment for me to examine the box and detach at one end my earliest picture of the tree, and at the other end a strange bit of amber-colored crystal, cut in devious angles impossible to classify. The touch of the glass fragment seemed curiously warm and electric, and I could scarcely bear to put it out of sight in Theunis's wall safe. The snapshot I handled with a disconcerting mixture of emotions. Even after I had replaced it in the envelope with the rest, I had a morbid longing to save it and gloat over it and rush out and up the hill toward its original. Peculiar line arrangements sprang out of its details to assault and puzzle my memory. Pictures behind pictures, secrets lurking in half-familiar shapes. But a saner, contrary instinct, operating at the same time, gave me the vigor and avidity of unplaceable fear as I hastily kindled a fire in the grate and watched the problematic envelope burn to ashes. Somehow I felt that the earth had been purged of a horror on whose brink I had trembled, and which was none the less monstrous because I did not know what it was. Of the source of Theunis's terrific shock I could form no coherent guess, nor did I dare to think too closely about it. It is notable that I did not at any time have the least impulse to look through the box before removing the gem and photograph. What was shown in the picture by the antique crystal's lens or prism-like power was not, I felt curiously certain, anything that a normal brain ought to be called upon to face. Whatever it was, I had myself been close to it, had been completely under the spell of its allurement, as it brooded on that remote hill in the form of a tree and an unfamiliar landscape, and I did not wish to know what I had so narrowly escaped. Would that my ignorance might have remained complete! I could sleep better at night. As it was, my eye was arrested before I left the room by the pile of scattered papers rustling on the table beside the black box. All but one were blank, but that one bore a crude drawing in pencil. Suddenly recalling what Theunis had once said about sketching the horror revealed by the gem, I strove to turn away, but sheer curiosity defeated my sane design. Looking again almost furtively, I observed the nervous haste of the strokes, and the unfinished edge left by the sketcher's terrified seizure. Then, in a burst of perverse boldness, I looked squarely at the dark and forbidden design, and fell in a faint. I shall never describe fully what I saw. After a time I regained my senses, thrust the sheet into the dying fire, and staggered out through the quiet streets to my home. I thanked God that I had not looked through the crystal at the photograph, and prayed fervently that I might forget the drawing's terrible hint of what Theunis had beheld. Since then, I have never been quite the same. Even the fairest scenes have seemed to hold some vague, ambiguous hint of the nameless blasphemies which may underlie them and form their masquerading essence. And yet the sketch was so slight, so little indicative of all that Theunis, to judge from his guarded accounts later on, must have discerned. Only a few basic elements of the landscape were in the thing. For the most part, a cloudy, exotic-looking vapor dominated the view. Every object that might have been familiar was seen to be part of something vague and unknown and altogether unterrestrial. Something infinitely vaster than any human eye could grasp, and infinitely alien, monstrous and hideous as guessed from the fragment within range. Where I had, in the landscape itself, seen the twisted, half-sentient tree, there was here visible only a gnarled, terrible hand or talon with fingers or feelers shockingly distended and evidently groping towards something on the ground or in the spectator's direction. And squarely below the writhing, bloated digits I thought I saw an outline in the grass where a man had lain. But the sketch was hasty, and I could not be sure. End of The Tree on the Hill by Duane W Rimel and H P Lovecraft. The Jewels of Charlotte by Duane Rimel. Unusual Stories, May to June 1935. You will perhaps question my story of incidents which occurred in the mouldering old town, but I think they will be of interest nonetheless. Constantine Theunis leaned back in his chair luxuriously, We were seated in his elaborate parlor before a crackling fireplace blaze. The lights were extinguished, and a chill autumn wind howled eerily about the house, giving a threat of snow. But the flickering shadows and austere atmosphere were secondary to Thunis himself. Lighting his pipe, he gazed steadily at the roaring flames, clearly deep in thought. He had asked me over to hear a story of some sort, the exact nature of which he had not yet explained. "You remember my vacation in July, Single?" "Of course," I replied, recalling that the old town he spoke of must be Hampton, where he had for a week visited in search of solitude and antiques. While there, a peculiar train of events occurred which I've been keeping quiet all this time. 2 federal agents. A sheriff and myself were the only ones who dug into the whole thing. They from duty and I from curiosity. And we found. But first I must go back a bit. As you know, Hampton is a most curious mixture of the new and the old, that being one reason for my sojourn there. It is an isolated place, stuck down between forbidding hills and inhabited by natives who believe every bit of gossip that comes to their ears. They do not exactly welcome strangers, and my arrival at the hotel was not a very pleasant occasion. But I wished to look over some of the stone carvings near the village and explore a bit in the nearby caverns. For 5 days I had a splendid time, absorbing an abundance of good mountain air, peering into the hillside caverns and soaking in some local gossip as well. On every hand I heard mutterings of varied description, subdued whispers which seemed to occupy the whole time of the village wits and loafers. My efforts to persuade some of them to confide in me met with failure. In fact, at times they appeared to resent even my presence. The landlord was noticeably sullen and never seemed to care whether the meals were served or not. Finally, I found that most of their everlasting mutterings centered about some sort of fabulous gems known as the Jewels of Charlotte. Nothing more concerning them, however, reached my ears. It was amusing to watch how a group of villagers would suddenly cease their talking at my approach. Toward the last, I grew more and more inquisitive about imagine my surprise when, on the 6th day, upon entering my hotel, I found 2 responsible-looking gentlemen whom I had met several times in Croydon. They were the agents I spoke of. We exchanged greetings, they seeming as pleased as I to find an acquaintance among these surroundings. They had parked their car in the rear, and I had not seen it in approaching the place. Luckily, they had arranged for a room adjoining mine. We immediately became confidential, that is, so far as their professions would allow. I knew that a manhunt or something equally important was brewing, since 2 seemed so large a force for so small a hamlet. They had not confided in anyone but the county sheriff, they said, and explained that their purpose must not leak out. Both men were about 40, the eldest, Sergeant, doing the most talking. His companion, Roberts, seemed less inclined to speak. They were dressed in civilian clothes, and I doubt if any villager suspected their true identities or purpose. It was only by chance that I learned of their mission at all, and this chance led up to the most unexplainable at dinner. That evening the 2 were strangely quiet. At the same table sat a rough-looking individual whom I took to be the sheriff. I was seated in one corner, partaking slowly of the meal placed in front of me by the disheveled waiter. The 3 had not ordered. An unaccountable tenseness reigned over the room. The other occupants went on about their business. A window close by was open, and the distant croaking of frogs came faintly to my ears. The 2 agents half-faced me while the sheriff was turned squarely in the opposite direction. I bring out these details in view of what subsequently happened. As I said, the frogs were chorusing, and the air seemed loaded with an unknown malign quality. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, there sounded a golden mellow chime. The air was filled with a momentary flood of sweet, sinister music that rang like the voices of woodland nymphs on the cool mountain air. It made my flesh creep. There was a distinct element of the unknown and forbidden in that one elfin-like tone. For an instant the air seemed charged with a vibrant, tangible force, elusive as a rainbow, yet startling and chilling in its utter unearthliness. To say where it came from would be impossible. Simultaneously it seemed to spring from the dark hills and from the very air of the room. I know I must have been startled, for my fingers trembled on the tabletop. The effect on the natives was startling. Every one of them froze in attitudes of intense listening. The rugged sheriff cursed under his breath and rose quickly to his feet. The faces of the two marshals showed nothing but awed surprise, and my own must have reflected the same emotion. My God, Single, I can hear that chime ringing yet, a mellow echo, breathtaking in its suddenness, and inherently evil and unreal. I could make nothing of it. About me, the few occupants seemed somehow to recognize that note, and to fear it. The sheriff grasped his hat and hurriedly left the ill-lit room, followed by the federal officers, who glanced now and then out the open windows. I heard them pass around to the back, start their powerful automobile, and roar away into the night. I wondered if their destination concerned the haunting, sinister note. I left the dining room, unable to take my thoughts from the thing. I need not describe the utter terror and fear that lined the faces of the people in that room. There was something altogether horrifying in the effect which the one sound had upon them, something that was dimly echoed in my own uneasiness. That night in my room I was awakened by the sound of voices. The strange chime had filled my thoughts before retiring, and I must have slept lightly. The conversation was coming from the adjoining room, the thin walls permitting the words to filter through very distinctly, though. I assure you, I never intended at any time to eavesdrop. My bed was close to the wall. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and saw that a shaft of moonlight played on the bare floor. Then I listened closely to the talking, which originated from the three who had left so mysteriously earlier in the evening. It finally became apparent that they were trailing two suspicious characters who had arrived in Hampden under great secrecy. I thought it strange that I had neither seen nor heard of their coming, but as you know, the townfolk had told me absolutely nothing. I expected them to say something concerning the lone chime, and finally, many moments later, the conversation indeed turned in that direction. I was, of course, wondering why they had not referred to it so far. To my astonishment, the two outsiders knew nothing about it and confessed they were greatly puzzled at the sound. I listened, fairly holding my breath, as they plied the sheriff with questions. He seemed reluctant to talk of it. Some time later, though, after a long interlude of whispering, the fellow began an unusual story. As I remember it, his guttural words told a tale something like this. A long time ago, when Hampden was nothing but a settlement, a strange man and his daughter Charlotte came there from God knew where and built a house over by the hills. No one could say just how long ago this was, but the man, now very old, still lived in the same dwelling. People had long since quit going near the rotting place, which crouched under those overhanging cliffs. At any rate, his beautiful daughter Charlotte fell from the high mountains to her death, as the legend went, and the old fellow, his name was Cruth, never recovered from the shock. Some said he built an enormous tomb in the fastness of the hills where he laid his beloved child. Others said he had spirited her away to other places. Most people believed in the hidden tomb. About 2 years after her death, there arose rumors to the effect that there were gems of uncountable wealth buried within the tomb of Charlotte. No one knew just what they were, though some said diamonds, others pearls, and others opals. An intense longing grew among some of the younger people to subdue Cruth, hunt up the hidden tomb and loot it of its enormous fortune. There was, of course, much uncertainty about the matter, but for years it had been the talk of the townspeople, especially after the occurrence of a certain incident. In the fervor of the new gossip, a group of young men, 5 in all, decided to explore into the hills in quest of the mysterious sepulchre. This was, of course, nearly 20 years ago, and at the time most of the people had laughed when anyone mentioned the mysterious jewels. No one asked old Cruth about the affair or even cared to. The marauders started out one morning and did not reappear till late evening. They told strange, disjointed tales of finding the hidden place, but of fearing to enter at the last moment for some vague, unstated reason. No person could elicit anything concrete from the 5. They seemed reluctant to reveal the incidents of the previous day, and very little was learned of the mysterious tomb. The next day they were off in fevered haste, neglecting to tell anyone just where their find had been made. The townspeople waited another day, still tolerantly amused at the antics of the young men. But that night they did not make an appearance. And they never came back. Not a trace of them was ever found. Dozens of expeditions were sent into the hills, but none of them ever solved the riddle of the missing 5. After that, people did not laugh when anyone mentioned the jewels of Charlotte, as they eventually came to be known. Some doubted the existence of the jewels. The sheriff did himself. But here is the strangest and most significant part of the whole thing. That night when the five were expected back, about 8 o'clock, a very peculiar thing occurred. From somewhere in the hills there came a golden, mellow chime, and now that accursed ringing had been heard again, for the only time since then, and people were counting their families. But that wasn't all. About a month before, 2 ragged-looking men had come into Hampton and settled in a decrepit shack near the place where Old Man Cruth lived. From the first, the sheriff had not liked their actions, but there was nothing he could pin on them, so he just bided his time. At length, he saw them call on the old man, which was extremely singular, since Cruth had never cared for strangers. The sheriff had hidden in the brush, and when they came out of the house he saw that there was dark hate and anger on their faces. He could hear the old man's hoarse voice ordering them to take their accursed proposition and get out of his shack. When they had moved off a ways, Cruth stepped out and yelled so loudly that the words were clearly audible to the sheriff, and he never forgot them. The aged man, as he tottered on his feeble legs, had cried, "And if you monkey with those stones, the chime will ring again." The sheriff hadn't known whether they actually read any significance in the phrase, but their faces surely looked as if they had. That had only been 2 days ago. Then the marshals arrived. "Do you wonder," concluded the sheriff, "that I jumped up and beat it for those fellows' shack this evening when we heard it? But it was empty, and tonight the thing rang again. I did not sleep well that night. Upon rising the next morning, I decided to make a clean breast of my eavesdropping. At breakfast I told the 2 marshals what I had heard. At first they were displeased, but in the end they seemed glad to confide in me. The story had affected them fully as much as it had me. Indeed, they believed that a sinister element hovered over the whole region and the whole affair. It was an idea that had bothered me a great deal as well. We were talking the matter over when the sheriff arrived, and I was introduced to the man to whom I had listened the night before. He was an interesting individual, once one became acquainted with him. Sargent and Roberts explained my interest in the affair and the chance eavesdropping that had occurred. He was more than willing to have another man in the swing. We set out immediately for Cruth's house to investigate the matter of the 2 missing men. My own interests centered around the strange sound, and I think the sheriff's did too. But it was all so hopelessly jumbled that none of us knew just where to start. As the car roared down the road toward the ancient abode, I happened to glance at the local officer. His gaze, instead of resting on the rapidly approaching house, was fastened longingly on the forbidding wooded slopes. He had not mentioned that a brother of his had been among the missing 5. When we pulled up at the ramshackle dwelling, the only sign of life was a thin ribbon of smoke rising from the leaning chimney. Far above loomed the dark hills and rugged outcroppings of black rock. About the place were tall, moss-covered pines which seemed to shroud the house in a blanket of perpetual gloom. We approached the house, and the sheriff rapped on the door. For several moments no sound came from within, then a hobbling movement and the door creaked open. An age-wrinkled face glared out at us. Cruth's eyes were sunken and bloodshot, and he braced himself feebly against the warped door jamb. "What do you want?" he asked weakly, his lined hands clasped tightly around his cane. Sargent stepped forward. "We want to know if you have seen your 2 neighbors this morning." "My neighbors," he croaked. "Those damned thieves aren't no neighbors of mine. I haven't seen 'em, and I don't want to." "Why not?" queried Sargent. "Why?" wheezed the old man. "Because they wanted me to tell them how to get to the tomb of my girl, my little girl, and her pretty stones." His voice grew weaker and trailed off. Then suddenly, "But I told 'em, and last night, his breath was failing. The chime rang. Again, the chime, the golden chime. "Come on, let's go," the sheriff whispered. We complied, but the old fellow still stood in the doorway gibbering, half to himself. We heard his last words faintly, and I shall never forget them. And I think soon the chime will ring. Again. For I know the way well. Through the ancient gate and beyond. Where, in Yith my Charlotte will not be broken. And I shall pass. The roar of the motor drowned out further words. Words I wish we had listened to. Words which might have been the key to the whole thing. As the faded dwelling passed from sight around a curve in the road, I felt a queer tinge of sorrow course through me. The sheriff stared straight into the weaving road. He too had heard. We stopped momentarily at the shack where the two fugitives had lived, but found it completely empty, with signs of recent habitation quite evident. The decrepit hut seemed too empty and suggestive after the visit with the old man, and we left hurriedly. It soon disappeared from sight as the car sped down the winding road, and I was relieved to be gone from the mouldering thing that hinted at something wholly alien and sinister, something that should be left undisturbed. It was strange how I felt, for some unexplainable reason, that the former occupants would never return to their lowly dwelling. I left that evening on an outgoing stage. I don't know whether they ever solved the secret or not. At least nothing ever appeared in the papers. So far as I'm concerned, it can stay hidden. The look in old man Cruth's eyes still lingers hauntingly with me. There was a deep wisdom behind that ancient voice, a wisdom which perhaps should not be discussed. That night, as the stage swung up and around the many turns of highway which leads out of Hampton, I watched the flickering lights of the tiny city fade away in the distance. Far to the west, the afterglow bathed the beetling hills in rosy splendor, and below, deep shadows were gathering in ravines and gullies. And as the panorama faded slowly from view, I heard, above the roar of the motor, a single haunting and never to be forgotten chime that echoed and re-echoed faintly in the gathering dusk. End of The Jewels of Charlotte by Duane Rimel. Music of the Stars by Duane W Rimel. First published The Acolyte, Spring 1943. There are black zones of shadow close to our daily paths, and now and then some evil soul breaks a passage through. H P Lovecraft, The Thing on the Doorstep. I am called a murderer because I destroyed my best friend, killed him in cold blood. Yet I will try to prove that in so doing I performed an act of mercy. Removed something that never should have broken through into this three-dimensional world, and saved my friend from a horror worse than death. Men will read this and laugh and call me mad, because much that happened cannot be labelled and proven in a court of law. Indeed, I often wonder if I beheld the truth, I who saw the ghastly finish. There is much in this world, and in other worlds, that our five senses do not perceive, and what lies beyond is found only in wild imagination and dream. I only hope that I killed him in time. If I can believe what I see in my dreams, I failed, and if I waited too long before I fired that last bullet, I shall welcome the fate that threatens to devour me. Frank Baldwin and I were comrades for 11 long years. It was a friendship that intensified as time went on, nourished by avid mutual interests in weird music and literature. We were born and raised in the same village, and it was, as a cultured author and correspondent of ours who lived in Providence often remarked, unusual to find two people with such bizarre interests in a village whose population was less than 600. It was fortunate, yes, but now I wish we had never probed so far into spheres of the awful unknown. The trouble began April 13th, 1940. I was visiting my friend that day, and during a rambling conversation, he hinted that he had discovered on the piano several combinations of musical tones that disturbed him. It was evening, and we were alone in the huge two-story house that stands there today, mouldy and empty beneath a giant maple, gaunt reminder of the horror we unleashed within it. Baldwin was a pianist of great ability, and I admired the talent which dwarfed my own musical skill. The wild, weird music he loved often drove me into fits of melancholy I could not fathom. It is indeed a pity that none of those original manuscripts were saved, for many of them were classics of horror, and others so fantastic that I would hesitate to call them music at all. His statement troubled me. Heretofore he had had utter confidence in his mad keyboard wanderings. I offered assistance. Saying nothing, he went to the piano, switched on a nearby floor lamp and sat down. His dark eyes fastened on the keys, his lithe, white fingers poised above them for an instant and descended. There was a weird cascade of sound as he ran the whole tone scales from one end of the piano to the other, followed by a series of intricate variations that startled and amazed me. I had never heard anything to compare with it. It was utterly out of the world. I listened, entranced, as his flying fingers wove a curious symphony of horror. I cannot describe that music any other way. The strains were eerie and unearthly, and stirred the very reaches of my soul. It resembled no standard classical music such as Rachmaninoff's Isle of the Dead, or Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre. It was tortuous, musical madness. At last, the thing ended with a crash of discord, and a strained silence fell over the shadowy room. Baldwin turned, face taut, and put his fingers to his lips. He pointed at the wall beyond the piano. At first I thought he was jesting, but when I saw his pale, handsome face drawn and worried, I glanced at the darkened walls and listened. For a while I heard nothing. Then a faint, insidious rustling disturbed the silence. It could have been a mouse running across the floor upstairs. But this sound came from the walls. The patter of tiny claws on wood, the rustle of small bodies. Rats. Many rats scrambling in the walls. Gradually the squeaking and scratching diminished and became a trickle of sound that faded away in the direction of the cellar. I stood up, trembling. Baldwin faced me, eyes gleaming, jaw set. "I've done it, Rambo. I always thought I could. There's a music that stirs every kind of beast, even ourselves. Look at the Pied Piper. I've made history repeat itself. But I'm going further. I'm going to compose the music that makes men go mad, learn the music of the stars, even if I have to use special instruments to do it." I tried to pass it off as a joke, but he was quite serious. Baldwin had always been willful, and I knew that argument was futile. However, I will admit that the very idea began to fascinate me. And what mental barriers I had built were weakening as I listened further to his strange plan. For the weird and macabre are as much a part of me as they were a part of him, and the odd music had cast a curious spell over me. Yet I was skeptical, and told him so. I failed to grasp his ultimate ambition. Perhaps he hadn't thought of it then, but the possibilities of the thing were staggering. We had read that strange story of Eric Zahn and the fate he met tinkering with musical threads of the ultimate void. Nor were we ignorant of the savage music with which certain tribes in Haiti summon their evil gods. We had tried for years to find copies of various forbidden tomes of ancient lore, the Necronomicon by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, the Strange Book of Ibon, and Ludwig Prin's Hideous de Vermis Mysterious. But in vain. We had lived the simpler, weird excitements, nights in haunted houses and mouldy graveyards, digging corpses by candlelight. But we wanted the real thing, though always it was just beyond our fingertips. Even our learned friend in Providence could not help us. He had read passages from a few of the less terrible books, and cautioned us time and again. Now I am glad we never found them, for what we did unearth was bad enough. I am tempted to believe that our friend, with his wide influence among the fantaisiste, made an effort to keep those self-same books from reaching us. Certainly, several good leads vanished into thin air. On one of my rounds of bookshops in Spokane I had found, by sheer accident, an English translation of the Chronique von Nath by the blind German mystic Rudolf Jürgler, who in 1653 finished his momentous work just before his sight gave out. The first edition sent its author to a madhouse in Berlin and earned for itself a public suppression. Although modified by the translator James Sheffield, 1781, the text was wild beyond imagination. As Baldwin gradually disclosed his scheme for composing the music of the stars, he referred again and again to passages in the Chronicle of Nath. And this frightened me, for I too had read it, and knew that it contained odd musical rhythm patterns designed to summon certain star-born monsters from the Earth's core and from other worlds and dimensions. For all that, Jürgler had not been a musician, and whether he had copied the formulae from older tomes or was himself their father, I was never able to find out. Surely Baldwin had dreamed a strange dream. He said the preliminary work would require solitude for a week at least. That would give him sufficient time to decipher the sinister formulae in the ancient book and to make adjustments on his lunar chord upstairs. He was a master technician and had found on his instrument tonal combinations that baffled fellow musicians. Milt Hirth, of radio fame, has done the same thing on a Hammond organ, which the lunochord closely resembles. Since a lunochord's tones are actually electrical impulses, controlled by 15 dials on the intricate panel above the two keyboards, and capable of imitating anything from a bass horn to a piccolo, the variations are endless. Baldwin estimated that there were roughly over 1 million tonal possibilities, although many would possess no distinction. I wondered at first how he had planned to invent such outry music on a mere piano. But here, ready-made, was the solution. A scientific achievement awaiting exploration. Walking homeward beneath a pale half-moon, my enthusiasm waned. He had not mentioned precisely what he intended to summon with his alarming music. Yergler himself was singularly vague on that point, or else Sheffield had deleted sections of the hideous text, an entirely logical premise. Indeed, what earthly music, i.e., musical tones audible to the human ear, could call from the gulf something totally unearthly? My better judgment revolted. Baldwin was lighting dangerous fires, but the very limits of man's knowledge regarding space, time and infinity would keep him from getting his fingers burned. Still, Yergler had done it, or something just as bad, and I recalled Sheffield's preface, which gave a guarded account of the alchemist's mysterious death in the madhouse. During a severe thunderstorm there was heard outside and above his room a hideous cacophony, seeming to come from the very heavens. There had been a broken shutter, a wild scream, and Yergler had been found slumped in a corner of the room in an attitude of extreme terror, dead eyes bulging upward. His face and body pitted with holes that resembled burns but were not. However, I knew that many early historians had possessed the grievous fault of gross exaggeration and verbal distortion. I could scarcely wait for the ensuing week to pass, realizing that Baldwin was alone in that upstairs room, browsing in a blasphemous book from the past and composing weird music on his devil's machine. But at last Saturday came, and I approached his door about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, because I knew he hadn't seen the sunrise for years. Encouraged by seeing a finger of smoke twist from the leaning chimney, one opened the sagging wooden gate, crossed the shadow of the maple, and knocked on the door. Presently it opened, and I was shocked at the change in my friend's face. He had aged 5 years. New lines creased his pale brow. His greeting was mechanical. We sat in the parlor and talked, while he lit one cigarette after another. When I asked him if he'd had any sleep or solid food, he refused to answer. Baldwin did his own light housekeeping, and unless watched, never ate enough to keep more than half alive. I told him he looked terrible, but he passed it off with a wave of his hand. What hellish thing had made him a gaunt image of his former self? I remonstrated. I demanded that he leave that sinister music and get some rest. He wouldn't listen. I began to become afraid of what he'd discovered, for it was evident he had met with success of a sort. His very manner said so. Without further conversation, he remarked that he'd be busy all afternoon, and told me to return at 10:30 that evening. I inquired about the experiment, but it was of no use. I left, promising to come back at the appointed hour. When I rapped on his door again, I had in my pocket a .38 revolver I'd bought in town that very afternoon. I cannot say precisely what I planned to shoot. The gesture was prompted by a feeling of impending tragedy. There had been in Baldwin's manner a reticence I didn't like, always before he had told me of his triumphs and discoveries. Without a word, Baldwin led me to the upstairs room. Motioning me to a chair near the lunochord, he sat on the bench and turned the switch that operated the electric motors. The thinness and pallor of his cheeks frightened me. He crushed out his cigarette and faced me. "Rambo, you've been very patient. I know you're curious. You also think I'm killing myself. I'll rest up for a while when I get through here. I think I've found what I'm after, the rhythm of space, the music of the stars and the universe that may be very near or very far. You know how we've hunted for those other books, the Necronomicon, and so on? This translation of Yergler isn't very clear, but I've tried to bridge the gaps and produce the results he hinted at. You see, at the very beginning there were two altogether different types of music, the type we know and hear today, and another one that isn't really earthly at all. It was banned by the ancients, and only the early historians remember it. Now, the Negro jazz element has revived some of these outry rhythms. They've almost got it. These polyrhythmic variants are close. Boogie Woogie has a touch. Earl Hines came near with his improvisation. Child of a disordered brain. What will happen? I can't say. Yesterday I had a letter from Lancaster in Providence, and he's positively scared. I told him my plans the last time I wrote. He finally admitted that he'd read the original Chronique, which is infinitely more terrible than this book we have. Lancaster warns me repeatedly against playing the music he's afraid I've written. Actually, it can't be written. There are no such symbols. It would require a new musical language. I'm not going to try that just yet, however. But it can't be that bad. He says there might even be some violent manifestation. The music might summon a certain thing from the shadows of another dimension. What I've done surely can't do anything like that. But it will be an interesting experiment. And remember, Rambo, no interruptions. I wanted to grab him by the neck and shake some sense into his head. My mouth opened twice, but no words came. He had started to play, and the whispering chords silenced me quicker than a hand clapped over my mouth. I had to listen. Genius will permit nothing else. I was bewitched, eyes fastened on his flying fingers. The music swelled, following strange rhythm patterns I had never heard before and hope never to hear again. They were unearthly, insane. The music stirred me deeply. Goose pimples raced over me. My fingers twitched. I crouched forward on the edge of the chair, tense, alert. A wave of cold horror swept me as the awful melody and counter-melody rose to a higher pitch. The instrument quivered and screamed as with agony. The mad fantasia seemed to reach beyond the four walls of the room, to quaver into other spheres of sound and movement, as if some of the notes were escaping my ear and going elsewhere. Baldwin's pale lips were set in a grim smile. It was madness. The rhythms were older than the dawn of mankind, and infinitely more terrible. They reeked of a nameless corruption. It was evil, evil as the druid's song, or the lullaby of the ghoul. During a sudden lull in the music, it happened. The skylight above us rattled, and the moonlight splashing the glass seemed to liquefy and race downward. A single bolt of intense whiteness smashed the glass, and the entire pane buckled inward. It struck the floor with a crash. The floor lamp dimmed and went out. Still the mad overture continued, its hideous echoes shaking the entire house, seeming to reach into infinity, to caress the very stars. In the dim, uncertain moonlight, I saw my friend crouched over the keyboard, oblivious to all else but the music. Then, above his head, I saw something else. At first it was only a deeper shadow, then it moved. My mouth opened and I screamed, but the sound was lost in that bedlam of horror. The blob of shadow floated downward, a shapeless mass of denser blackness. It thickened and gradually took shape. I saw a flaming eye, a slimy tentacle, and a grisly paw extending downward. The music stopped, and the silence of the utter void enveloped us. Baldwin leaped to his feet, turned and looked upward. He screamed as the blackness shifted nearer, and a smoky talon seized him. His face in the dim light was a mask of horror. I pawed at the gun in my pocket, gazing transfixed as the writhing shadow from outside slowly encircled his head. Unsteadily, imitating the movements of a zombie, Baldwin raised his arms to fend off the monstrosity, and they were lost in the heaving shadow. I must have gone slightly mad then, for there is much I cannot remember. I know I leaped at the cloud, drove my fists into it. My hands touched nothing, though I recall a fetid odor. The revolver had somehow leaped into my hand, and I fired at the mass 5 times. The bullet smashed the wall. Nothing else. Something struck me on the temple, and I fell backward. It may have been one of Baldwin's pawing arms. I do not know. A loud crash of discordant sound brought me to my senses. I lay on my back on the moonlit floor, revolver in hand. A nauseating odor brought me to my knees, gasping for air. Baldwin had slumped backward over the keyboard, inert. The notes piped on, filling the chamber with hideous discord. The horror I could not see, but I felt it near. Baldwin's head rolled and jerked up. It was no longer human, something ghastly and alien. It was dotted with tiny gouts of blood and with holes that looked like burns, but were something else. His lips writhed, and he groaned through clenched teeth. "Rambo! Rambo! I can't see. Are you there? It's got me, part of me. Run for your life. Shoot me. Kill me. I can't let it. Get the rest." His command froze me with horror. In that instant I lived 10 years. I forgot the impossible shadow and the lurking fear. I saw only my friend's face and the fond memories it recalled. I thought of peaceful, sunny days spent in earnest conversation beneath the huge maple. I thought of saner nights and saner music. But that vision darkened, and the horror returned. Baldwin sank lower, his grip on the instrument gave way, and he tumbled to the floor, face upward in the moonlight. The last ghastly echoes rang in my ears. Then silence. I saw the awful shadow near his head, its groping claws outstretched. I waited no longer. I knew he meant what he said. With trembling hand I raised the revolver and shot him in the temple. My last conscious effort was a mad scramble down the twisting stair. I stumbled and fell into a pit of darkness. Hours later I awoke and groped my way through the house, staggered out into the moonlight. My mind was blank. I could remember very little. The terrible events were a chaotic jumble of horror. As I ran, I kept looking over my shoulder, staring at the peak of the dark gable near my friend's upstairs room. I've confessed, and I suppose the judge and jury will hang me. I really can't blame them. They would never understand why I killed him. And now I too must pay with my life for meddling in those forbidden realms of nightmare. All of Baldwin's manuscripts were burned, including the copy of Yergler's evil book, by a special court order. It seems the neighbors heard the screams and the savage music. And now another terror haunts me. Often in my dreams I see a nebulous cloud of utter blackness dropping from the nighted sky to engulf me. And in the center of that nimbus I see a face, a hideous distortion of something that once was human and sane. The face of my friend, pitted and burned, even as the grisly face of Yergler's must have been. End of Music of the Stars by Duane W Rimel. The City Under the Sea by Duane W Rimel. Two men of the modern world are cast into a strange undersea kingdom. Belton, traitor to the surface world, who plans to conspire with the rulers of the lost city to use their super science against the nations of the upper world. And Huffman, who fights a hopeless battle to save his world from ruin. I know that my story of the lost race will sound incredible, but you must believe it. I have waited many years to tell this, waited so that I could present a picture undistorted by imagination and nightmare. Waited and hoped that time would dim that horror and the exquisite memory of a love forever lost. No balm will heal that wound. No drug nor bottle can ever let me forget Allah, the wondrous Allah, the beautiful creature from the city beneath the sea. And sometimes I am glad that I can remember. The curious wine-colored diving suithangs in my study today, and locked within my safe is the slip of vellum covered with odd hieroglyphics that no etymologist can decipher. It is best, perhaps, that they cannot, for the world is yet too savage and warlike to use such knowledge wisely. Scientists who have examined the diving suit admit that it is decades ahead of anything on the market today, but they think some crank invented it. Let them laugh. Someday that race of supermen beneath Chersonesus will arise and astound the world. The episode began on the floor of the Black Sea, 2 miles from Sebastopol. I was a diver with the Grinovich expedition, tabulating certain information concerning the ancient Greek city of Chersonesus, which sank beneath the sea 2,000 years ago. We were sending information by phones in our helmets to technicians and draftsmen on the mother ship who were drawing maps of the place. While the dredging and exploration were underway, you may have read consolidated press items regarding 2 divers who were lost and reported dead, their cables and air hoses mysteriously slashed on the ocean bottom. These men were Kurt Belton and John Huffman, an American. Then 3 days later you doubtless read about the man picked up on a desert isle near Sebastopol, a man carrying a strange diving suit and professing to be one John Huffman. You may have joined the press in smiling at his wild tales of a vast undersea city, where he had lived, he said, the whole time since his disappearance. The world would not believe that this man was Huffman, although his resemblance to photographs of the original John was striking. And then the world sighed and forgot the raving lunatic. I was that man. Our work was slow and tedious. I had bluffed my way into the service through the influence of my friend, Kurt Belton, a Baravian and an experienced diver. Later, I regretted my boldness. I knew little about undersea operations, but Belton and I usually worked together, and he knew enough to keep me on for 3 weeks, until the curious accident occurred. That day, we were assigned to a deeper and unexplored area where visibility was poor and verbal description difficult. We moved slowly through deep silt, seeing, amidst fantastic clumps of vegetation, great lichen-covered pillars, dating unmistakably from the Hellenistic period, yet so obscured by debris that accurate observation was almost impossible. The ocean floor was unusually rough. Suddenly, Belton lifted his arm, a danger signal. I waded toward him. He pointed down, close to his metal-shod feet. The beam from my torch lit his helmet. His round face beyond the barred glass seemed excited. I looked. His light revealed a wide stairway slanting downward into the watery gloom of a large cavern. Over 20 feet below, the steps ended, and the passage turned at right angles. A stair so remarkably preserved and so free of rubble was amazing, uncanny. No current swirled from this puzzling shaft. Belton touched my arm, motioned that he would descend. I started to give an account over the phone, but he halted me with a familiar gesture. This was against regulations, but why not? My friend called for more cable and started down, his torch gleaming weirdly on the steps, which I noticed were rounded and worn, as if from centuries of use. What kept the tunnel so clean? I followed, telling Orof we were entering a deep ravine. We went downward slowly, came to the bottom of the stair, and turned. No debris blocked our way. Incredible. Our light stabbed ahead, revealing a side stone corridor. Dark, unfamiliar fish darted past. The passage continued for perhaps 30 feet and ended at a door. At least it appeared to be a door. We advanced cautiously, keeping our cables and air lines free. Belton touched the smooth stone obstruction, flashed his torch over it. Then I saw a handle, a curious protuberance that did not resemble any we had seen in the sunken city above. Belton reached for it. I had a sudden impulse to stay his hand, and later I cursed myself for not doing so. I felt that we were entering a forbidden place, but I was eager as he to explore the mystery. Belton tugged. The door moved, outward. I helped, and the crack widened. Our torches lit another passage, like the first. Its walls, too, were polished clean. We moved slowly. Our cables were getting heavy. We couldn't go much further. Something in front of us moved. We halted. At the end of the corridor, a stone slab was opening. Then we saw the impossible. Two red-helmeted figures appeared as if by magic from behind the massive portal, human figures. They held strange weapons. Pink lights on top of their shiny helmets illuminated the entire tunnel, dwarfing our yellow beams. Only their eyes were visible. They indicated, by odd motions, that we surrender. I was so dumbfounded I could not move or think. Belton's hand started toward the metal hook at his belt. From the weapons flashed two bright blue rays. They struck his helmet, and he slumped, his face twisted with pain. Slowly he fell to the stone floor. Damn them! Had they killed him? I moved toward him, but the figure ahead waved its gun. I decided to stand still. They came forward cautiously. The leader motioned at the door behind him. I walked. The second creature seized Belton and dragged him like a sack of grain. Suddenly I came to my senses. I shouted into my phone. I waited. No reply. I tried again, but no welcome voice rang in my ears. The line was dead, shorted perhaps by the strange blue ray, which seemed to be some kind of electrical impulse. I was guided to the stone door whence they had emerged. Intelligent beings here beneath the Black Sea? Weird beams of light that killed at a distance. Had they killed? Poor Belton lay face downward, limp, unmoving. I cursed and prayed for a chance to strike back. The door opened. Beyond it, I glimpsed other red-suited figures. Madness to turn on my guard. I was outnumbered, and the men were swift and sure in their movements, as if they had lived in water all their lives. Bewildered and amazed, I was pushed through the doorway. We entered a square room lighted by red nodes on the ceiling. The two men who captured us moved toward the door, began closing it. My airline would be smashed. Belton's too. If he still lived. These red suits had no attachments. The door closed. At that instant, the leader raised his arm and a ray of blue stabbed me. My brain turned to ice. I slipped and fell into a great abyss. I awoke slowly, painfully. My ears roared. My head seemed to be sheathed in snow, which melted drop by drop to release my jangled thoughts. I was lying on my back, breathing air. No helmet. No diving suit. Where in hell? I opened my eyes and sat up. Weird, red light slanted through barred windows in the ceiling. 4 stone walls surrounded me. I was alone. The blue ray must have had a paralyzing effect only. If so, was Belton alive? Soft padding sounded overhead. Strange, inaudible voices. A section of the ceiling moved. I scrambled to my feet. Swaying drunkenly, my head sang, and I fought nausea. A narrow ladder was lowered, and a face bulked into that square of red light. An angular, evil face, white as alabaster. The man held a weapon. Another blue ray gun? "Come up," said the creature in English, my native tongue. "Here." I shook my head dazedly and climbed the ladder, stepping upon the smooth floor of a slender corridor. The man held my attention instantly. He was about 5'8", frail of body, and had the whitest skin I ever saw. A black, square-cut beard jutted from his chin. His prominent cheekbones, long thin nose and lean face reminded me of pictures of ancient Greeks or Egyptians. He wore a loose yellow cap over raven locks that hung to his shoulders, a yellow jacket and shorts that ended above his knees. His broad forehead and deep-set, piercing eyes denoted intelligence. I rubbed my chin, a 3-day growth of beard. Had I lain in that hole all the time? The stranger smiled wryly. "Walk, Mr. Huffman," he said in clipped, precise English. "Who in blazes are you?" I snarled. "Where am I?" "Proceed," he said stonily. I watched for a chance to dig my thumbs in his lean neck, but the gun was on me. I walked down the corridor. We passed many branching avenues and curtained doorways. Bright red lights were everywhere. Finally, we came to an ornately carved panel that reminded me of certain Egyptian bas-reliefs. Yet these were different, almost alien, a departure from all orthodox or worldly designs. Armed guards beside the door stared at me curiously and sneered. The jailer opened the carved rectangle. I faced a great assembly room. Several natives stood beside a raised platform, which was draped beautifully with purple satin. In a chair on the rostrum sat a middle-aged man whose distinguished look and bearing set him head and shoulders above the men around him. And beside that man was Belton, traitor to the surface world. I ran forward. "Belton, you old son of a gun! Halt!" the guard shouted, leaping in front of me. "You will say nothing until King Cthulhu asks you a question." Belton did not smile or raise a hand. He was garbed in their hateful yellow. What ailed him? The guard ushered me nearer the throne, but the Baravanian would not look at me. "You are here to be sentenced for trespassing on the kingdom of Altair," Cthulhu said sternly. His pale, thin lips writhed into a grin. His bleak eyes blazed fiercely. "Wait," I cried. "What about Kurt?" "Silence," roared the guard. "You heard. Bellow again, and I will blast off your ears." Pent-up rage stormed my brain. The throne room wavered and seemed to dance. I was weak. I staggered, righted myself before I fell. The gravity seemed tremendous. How deep in the earth were we? The king's voice came faintly. "Put in a suit and given 1 hour's supply of oxygen. If you find the land of the sun, you may live. Guard, take him away. His ignorant rage no longer amuses me." I retreated, shaking my fist. "Curse Belton!" The black-hearted traitor smiled as the jailer dragged me away. How had he squirmed into the king's confidence? Hours later, in my cell, I was awakened by a light tapping overhead. I crawled from the cold stone floor, weak and dizzy. Food and drink had been given me, but I was still ravenous. The tapping came again. "Who's there?" I growled. "Quiet," said a soft voice. I peered upward. Beyond the bars I saw a small, delicate face. A woman. She held her finger to her lips. I could see little more than a dim silhouette, but her manner gave me hope. "Mr. Huffman?" Her voice was rich, vibrant. "Yes. What do you want?" "I saw you today, in the throne room. I think I can help." "Listen," I snapped. "If this is a trick, get out." "Hush," she whispered, patiently. "Someone will hear you. I sent the guard on an errand to the laboratories. He won't be gone long." She pressed a package through the bars. "Here is more food. I know what they give prisoners." The fragrant odor of cooked meat tempted me to wolf it on the spot. Maybe she was telling the truth. "How can I get out of here?" I inquired. She sighed. "That is difficult, but I think I know a way. Here is a red ray gun. It should melt the bars. You will have to be very careful." She passed the strange pistol to me. I seized it, gloating. Far from freedom, but a fighting chance. "You are my savior," I choked. "What is your name?" "Allah of the First." She paused as if afraid to finish. "Call me John if you wish," I said. "I like that," she said simply. "Now listen closely while I tell you where to go and how to reach the airlocks if you get out. I wish I could go with you, but that is impossible." I listened. My life depended on it. "I have a paid assistant at the gates," she continued. "He has a suit hidden there for you, with enough oxygen for many days. You can surely reach the island above Altair. It isn't far, and our suits are light. How will I recognize this? Paid man. Don't worry, he will recognize you and show you where the equipment is. After that, you take your own chances." "Wait," I said. "What about Belton? Is he crazy? He and Cthulhu have large plans." "Plans?" "Yes, they are going to conquer Russia." Her simple statement floored me. Then I laughed. She shook her head. "You make fun of me. I mean what I say. My people are very wise. They know things about the sea that your races never suspect. They know how to control it, make it live and work. Water, alive," I snorted. "You're crazy. Water has no body, No, it is true, I tell you, she flared. Long ago, my people discovered the secret of the atom's power and the formula that molds water and makes it alive. The guardian of the secret can make water monsters, and my people command them, as you did your Negroes before the Civil War. You know American history? We learn many things here, John. So Belton and Cthulhu are going to conquer Russia with water. It can be done, she said emphatically. There are no size limitations. Cold water seemed to trickle down my back. Great God! The entire world would be thrown into a panic. Monstrous columns of water sweeping over cities, killing, crushing. I can't leave now, I groaned. Not with all that. No, she cried. You must do as I say. Go to the gates as quickly as you can. This is the sleeping period. The time for your banishment is not far off. 2 hours by your count. Promise me you will go. I will take care of Belton. How? I demanded. If what you say is true, what can you do against a king and a madman? Never mind, she said. I know a way. Will you promise? All right, I said reluctantly. If you kill that traitor, it's okay with me. Wait. Why are you so kind to me, an outsider? That is a mystery, perhaps, she said, looking away. The scarlet light made her dark hair a halo of lambent flame. An intoxicating perfume stole into my cell. How long has your race lived here? I inquired. For ages and ages, John. They came to Crimea from ancient Egypt, a small band of adventurers who foresaw the decay of their civilization in Africa. They established a city where Chersonesus once stood. Then the Greeks filtered in and began driving them out. Zando, a great leader of ours, conceived the fantastic plan of living under the sea. He was very wise and worked half his life on the idea. At last, he and his followers had a small retreat built, which he called Altair. Some of my ancestors had mingled with the Greeks and would not go, but a handful of the faithful retreated from the land of the sun, and we, their ancestors, are here today. Later the Greeks became very powerful, and my people heard that they were planning to destroy us, because we had grown and flourished, and they were afraid of us. Meanwhile, my people had discovered the secret of the water. Before the Greeks could strike, exactly how they were going to destroy us I have never learned. Our scientists sent great water things to the city. They undermined it, and Chersonesus sank beneath the waves. No nation has troubled us since that day. By the Great Father, I swore. I wish Grinovich knew about that. Listen, she hissed. The guard is coming. I must go. Goodbye, John. Her voice sounded queer. So long, Allah, I said. You're a peach. Then she was gone, swiftly as a shadow. Strange girl. I heard the guard's footsteps. I crouched on the floor, the queer weapon in my hand. Melt the bars? Why not kill the guard and snatch the keys? I waited tensely, but the man did not come near the barred windows. The footfalls retreated, and a tomb-like silence shrouded my cell. I gulped the food and the flagon of sweet wine. Hope surged like fire in my veins. Seizing the weapon, I held it close to the center bar and squeezed the trigger. A piercing red beam shot from the black muzzle. I focused the ray at one end of the bar. The metal smoked and turned crimson. White drops splashed on the stone floor, and I had to step lively. The bar came in two. Then I melted the other end, and the red-hot rod fell to the floor with a clatter. I eased up on the trigger. How long would this flame ray work? I shuddered when I realized what it could do to flesh and bone. Had the guard heard the commotion? I stuffed the gun into my overalls and leaped at the two remaining bars. There was room to squeeze between them. I hoisted my legs through and squirmed out upon the floor. No one was in sight. I sneaked along the dim, red corridor, found the door Allah had indicated. It was unlocked. I threw it open. A curtained room, low divans against the frescoed walls. Empty. I strode across the deep carpet, ray gun held ready. Cautiously, I parted the curtain that led to the next corridor. I saw 2 armed guards walking toward me. They would pass the aperture. I slipped the curtain into place and backed against the wall. My leg struck something. A stool. I tottered and fell into the curtain. The men shouted. I leaped backward and crouched. They smashed into the veil. I ripped the cloth away and fired. The first man screamed and crumpled. Caught off balance, the second guard released a blast. The gauze near my neck flamed, and I returned his fire. His white face contorted, and he slid to the floor, a great hole scorched in his chest. Blood gushed on the purple carpet. I shuddered. Killing wasn't my game, but, along the brilliant corridor, I ran. So far, I had found the place as Arla had described it. Every second counted now. Soon the dead men would be found, and an alarm sounded. I raced on. Suddenly I heard a familiar voice, and I halted, breathing deeply. Red anger engulfed me. That voice was Belton's. Beyond a curtained doorway, the traitor was speaking in Baravanian. I moved toward the sound and listened. Ready in 24 hours. I'll return and direct the land and air forces. Our armies are ready to seize the Yukon. You advance from the sea. We'll attack together. Once Russia falls, we'll go on. Nothing can stop us. The man was mad. That is fine, came another voice. Cthulhu, but you cannot have the secret. Why not? Belton demanded. Your scientists can make a copy. I promise that Baravania will not use it, but our military authorities should know what you are going to do, and how. No. Years ago, Lennox the Great discovered the secret of the power over water, but he did not write the formula. He knew it was a dangerous thing. Instead, he told it to 2 men, who were sworn to silence save at the nation's peril. These men are permitted, by law, to create small water slaves for our own use. We have made no giant ones for ages. However, since Russia is planning to blow us to bits, I think it wise to attack first. You can do what you like with the land. We don't want it. That's great, Belton grunted. Who are those 2 men that possess the knowledge? Cthulhu laughed, a thin, mocking laugh. That, too, is a mystery. But never fear. The monsters will be made, and we shall conquer the Yukon. They will frighten the enemy so badly you can march in without firing a shot. You have strange customs, Cthulhu. Strange to you, perhaps, but just. I pressed closer to the curtain. None of your people know who the Guardians are? Belton inquired, his voice somewhat thick. Only a chosen few, and those who know it not are silent about it. Naturally, I know. Why are you so interested? I've told you I will never part with that information. You never will, Belton snarled. So, I thought as much. Back against that wall. Quick, now tell me, or I'll blast you to hell. Curse you, Cthulhu screamed. You sneaking skunk. Shut up. Tell me, and hurry. Better yet, write it on a piece of paper. Here. At this desk. Now damn you, write. What to do? Enter now? Belton's gun must be out. I crouched and listened. The scratch of a pen. Cthulhu was writing the secret that would give Baravania a weapon against the world. I parted the curtain, slowly. Cthulhu was poised over a small desk, writing furiously. His captor's back was turned. Drop that gun, I barked. Belton spun. I fired at his hand. The metal weapon burst. He staggered backward. I should have killed him then, but memories of our friendship stabbed me, made me falter. Cthulhu bounded to his feet. Hold! I snapped, as his hand snaked toward the slip of paper. I'll take that, I said, walking to the desk. I folded the thick vellum and put it in my shirt pocket. The king trembled, his pale face knotted with rage. Struggle in the underworld, a clamour sounded in the hall behind me. Guards had found the bodies. Feet raced along the corridor. Cthulhu smiled. Belton's face was ashen. He nursed his bleeding hand and swore. The curtain ripped. I wheeled as Cthulhu laughed. I wanted to blast him, but The doorway belched 3 armed men. I burned the foremost. The second guard blazed at the light node on the ceiling. Darkness. I leaped and slid behind a couch. Red beams seared the floor where I had stood an instant before. Bodies thudded about the room. Hoarse screams rattled on my eardrums. I saw the doorway, barely visible in the murky darkness, and lunged for it. I caromed into a man. We locked arms and went down, pounding and threshing. My gun was booted from my hand. "Here he is," the man cried. I fought like a demon, but clawed fingers and writhing bodies hammered me to the floor. A spiked boot crushed my right hand. Something struck my head and I went limp. I was conscious but couldn't move a finger. Deft hands bound my wrists and ankles. Hope dashed. I had the secret, but for how long? My head whirled. My body ached from the terrific mauling. I was dragged across the floor. The lights were on, but I couldn't open my eyes. Someone cried, "Where is Cthulhu? Where is Belton?" "Look," shouted another. "There on the floor is the king's cape. He has been carried off. Belton, take this prisoner, lock him up. I'll sweat that guard later." "We go to search for Cthulhu," I fainted. Awareness returned. 2 guards were hustling me along the dim, red corridor that led to the prison. I was weak and dazed. My mangled hand bled and throbbed savagely. One man held me while the other opened a door in the floor. I was pushed to the edge of the pit, hurled downward. The floor crashed into me. My bruised body screamed as I tried to crawl. I lay still, sick with nausea. The guards tramped away. Silence. Where had Cthulhu gone? Had Belton seized him? I had the secret. The guards hadn't known about that. Perhaps it wasn't the secret. Cthulhu was tricky. Belton was desperate. No telling what he'd do. Russia planning to attack Altair? They didn't know the place existed, didn't care. Another lie of Belton's. A tapping on the bars above startled me. I rolled over and groaned as my broken hand slapped the cold stone. "John, John," said a soft voice. "Are you there?" I grunted. "Oh, I stole the keys. You must come, quickly." I heard a faint click. The grate rattled and raised. She lowered the ladder. I wobbled to my knees, giddy and exhausted. My throat burned. I seized the ladder and climbed, using my left hand. "Allah, you have saved me again." She gripped my hand, pulled me out on the floor. "You are hurt, John, but you must hurry. Guards are running everywhere. Cthulhu is missing. How did you know I was here?" I took a chance. "You never came to the gates." She pressed a ray gun into my left hand. "Follow me, John. I think we can reach the airlocks." She crossed the hall, touched a spot in the queer, decorated wall. A whirring noise, and a small door appeared. Taking my arm, she led me into a wall of blackness. Her flashlight gleamed on a steep, winding stair. We sneaked aloft swiftly. My head cleared as new hope burned within me. She led on. I thought the steps would never end. I gasped and panted as strength ebbed in a flood. At last, we stood before a door. Allah put her ear to it. Her pale, lovely face was drawn with fear. Poor kid. Her curved lips trembled. "There is a great commotion at the locks. We cannot go now. Cthulhu must be missing still." "Why didn't you tell me about this stair?" I inquired, admiring her slim, voluptuous figure beneath the gauzy robe. "You couldn't have opened the secret door." "We've got to go," I said, "if you want to save Cthulhu. I think Belton abducted him." "Oh no," she cried, her dark eyes flashing. "That would be sacrilege. Belton is mad," I snapped. "He'd do anything to get the secret. When he found out Cthulhu knew, he seized him." I didn't think it wise to mention the slip of paper. "How did you know this, John?" I told her about the wild episode in Cthulhu's chambers. "That is awful," she said. "Perhaps I should have let you know before. Cthulhu is my father." For an instant I was stunned. "Great Lord, now we've got to find him." "Listen, hear the men? They are organizing an expedition out into the sea to look for my father. He is not in Altair. That is what they say." I was afraid of that, I said. But how am I going to get a diving suit with all that going on? We shall have to wait until the men are gone. They will leave a guard. But I think I can go out and get a suit without arousing suspicion. That will work, I replied. If they don't discover you're helping their prisoner escape. She stood rigidly beside the door, listening. The noises and voices subsided. She turned and clutched my arm. I will try, she whispered. I started to grab her, but she opened the door and went through. I waited uneasily. No sounds beyond the panels. If they knew, the awful quiet jangled my nerves. I reached for the door. Suddenly it burst open. Ala staggered through under the weight of 2 suits. I slammed the door and bolted it. All is clear so far, she panted, dropping the gear. Swiftly we donned the suits. They were light but durable, more seaworthy than any diving suits I had ever seen. No cables or air hoses, condensed oxygen, unique sponges to absorb waste gases. Ingenious. Once the helmets were screwed in place, I was startled by Allah's voice. The suits had radio hookups. Follow me, John, and do what I do. We are joining the expedition to search for Cthulhu. Only your eyes are visible. You should not be recognized. When we get beyond the gates, watch your chance and head for the surface. Remember the small island. You can make that easily. Allah, I stammered. I hate to leave you like this. Let me help search for your father. If they find out you helped me, you'll be killed for treason. Perhaps, her soft voice replied. I won't leave you, John, if you don't want me to. Allah, darling. I gripped her shoulders and wished I'd come to my senses sooner. Now we were in suits. I opened the door. We walked boldly into a wide, familiar corridor. 2 helmeted guards eyed us suspiciously. I tried to move without limping. My gun was back there, behind that door. Having it might spoil our chances of escape. And the red ray guns were useless in water. Allah crossed the floor, approached the airlocks, and pressed a button that sprouted from a decorated switchboard. The huge, transparent door lifted. We slipped into the narrow compartment between it and the gate that held back the sea. The panel behind us lowered, operated, I guessed, by a timed automatic device. Would the guards get wise? I dared not look at them. I adjusted my gear as water gushed from vents in the floor. Soon it covered us. Allah looked at me, and her dark eyes seemed to smile. I glanced at the suited guards beyond the door. They had come very near, but the churning water made them mere blurred shadows. The chamber filled, and the water quieted. The guards watched me closely. One of them leaped forward and pointed at my right arm. I looked down, a red stain on the rubber suit. I'd been careless putting it on. Allah, too, had seen. One man sprang to the controls. The second gate lifted 2 feet and stopped. Allah touched my arm, and we dove at the crack. I pushed her through, but not all the way. She wouldn't budge from beneath the heavy jam. Hurry, John! Her strained voice rang in my earphones. The gate inched downward, stopped again. They saw her lying under the gate. Would they lower it? On the princess? I snatched her hand, but the obstinate little fool wouldn't budge, risking her life to save me. I crawled under the portal. Suddenly it moved. Down. They were going to do it. I seized her arms and dragged her through. Her right foot caught. Barely 6 inches left. I gave a mighty tug. Her metal-shod foot came free, but a small rip appeared in the rubber at her ankle. Allah gripped her leg, tried to hold back the water. I found a small rope at my belt and swiftly tied it below her knee, above the break. It might hold. Her eyes seemed to mirror fear and pain. She stood slowly, raised her arms and made strange motions in the water. The guards were emptying the lock. They were following. I seized her arm and pulled her along the corridor. Suddenly the water near me moved, as if alive. No currents here. We had not passed the second door. A mighty, invisible claw gripped me, lifted Allah from the floor. We were hurled along the sea-green tunnel. The huge door ahead opened as if a great hand had struck it. We flew on into blackness. The dark stairs swirled beneath us. The ocean floor. What dark power was this? We swept upward in the clutch of that monster. Water monster? Great God! Was this the thing Belton sought? Allah the other guardian? No time to marvel or speculate further. It happened too quickly. We were thrown on a sandy beach. I gasped. Coming upward so swiftly we'd have the bends for certain. But I was able to move. Allah! Are you all right? No answer in my phones. I clambered to my feet. She lay very still, eyes closed. I unscrewed her helmet, ripped away the suit. I lifted her and carried her to dry sand. She was soaked. Water ran from her nose and mouth. Her pale, lovely face was blue. I turned her over gently and gave her artificial respiration. I worked for long, agonizing moments. She quivered and coughed, spat pink water. She gulped air. The poor girl was suffering terribly. Allah, I cried. Are you better? Are you? Her eyelids fluttered and opened. She tried to smile. Brave darling. I held her hands and realized suddenly that my suit was still on. I scrambled out of it, and the cold struck me like a knife. No wonder her face was blue. 3 days in that heated madland had made me soft. The sun was setting. On the tiny island grew shrubs and stunted trees. I must build a fire. Above the wash of the surf, a voice cracked. "Hold it, Huffman! You're covered." I turned. Belton. His round, sallow face puckered into a grin. "Damn your black heart," I screamed. "If it hadn't been for you," he laughed. "Take it easy, John. All I want is that slip of paper. Then I can turn old Cthulhu loose, if he ever wakes up." I got him back on the island. "To hell with you," I snarled. His ray gun came nearer, as a sneer twisted his whiskered face. "Listen, Huff, I want that paper, and I don't care how I get it. Hand it over." I prayed for a chance to fight. Allah had fallen unconscious again. Belton advanced, smiling. I lunged. His gun jerked up, but no blast scorched me. A click. The thing was dead. I smashed a left to his jaw that sent him spinning. He crouched and tackled. I ducked and caught his wrist. I knew I had to use a trick. My right hand was useless. We went down, and I twisted his arm as we rolled in the sand. He wrenched free and smashed me in the mouth. I was weak, couldn't last long. He held me down, his fists jabbing my jaw. I twisted and seized his arm. He broke the hold and hammered me again. I was sinking. Suddenly Allah screamed. Belton quit pounding as the roar of water seemed to bear down upon us. He cursed and jumped away. I rolled and opened my eyes. A great wave cascaded around me, washing over Belton and Allah. It was more than a wave, a monstrous column of pale sea green that rippled across the sand like a huge snake. It writhed near me, but did not touch me. Then it slithered toward the pounding surf. In that mountain of water were Allah, Cthulhu, and Belton. "Allah! Allah!" I screamed as the tentacle parted the waves. I had a last glimpse of the curious trio before the sea claimed them, and I thought I saw Allah lift her hand. Then they were gone. The ocean near the beach heaved and whirled strangely, and the green waves rolled across the sand, as they had rolled for ages. Cthulhu had awakened on the island, and had returned for revenge. The following day a whaling ship out of Sebastopol sighted my crude flag and took me aboard. Later, I made my way to America on a tramp steamer. As I said at the beginning, no one will believe my story. Not that it matters, really, for Belton's mad dreams of empire are vanished, and the world is safe from that watery horror and the kingdom of Altair. Is Allah dead, or still living in that lost empire beneath Chersonesus? Someday perhaps I shall try to return, but deep in my heart I know that I shall never see her again. End of the City Under the Sea by Duane W Rimel.